I think you two are in the wrong cabin. The words cut through the pristine air of the first-class cabin like a knife sharp and intentional.
I'm not sure.
Vanessa Miller, led flight attendant on Horizon Airways, Flight 792, stood with perfect posture. Her blonde hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her smile practiced but cold. Her eyes swept over the two young black women seated in 1A and 1C, their expressions changing from relaxed to alert in an instant. The twins exchanged a quick glance, a silent communication perfected over 30 years of shared existence. The one by the window, Dr. Naomi Jackson, merely raised an eyebrow, her face otherwise composed. Her sister, Dr. Zoe Jackson, seated across the aisle, straightened almost imperceptibly, the only indication that she'd registered the flight attendant's words as anything other than a simple mistake. "Our boarding passes say otherwise," Naomi replied, her voice soft but precise, each word measured with scientific accuracy. She gestured to the digital boarding pass displayed on her phone, the seat assignment 1A clearly visible. Vanessa's smile tightened. There must be some mistake. These premium suites are typically reserved for our regular clientele. Her eyes flicked over their attire, Naomi in her tailored charcoal pants and cream cashmere sweater, Zoe in her silk navy blouse and designer jeans. Expensive clothing, certainly, but not the ostentatious wealth displayed by some of the other passengers boarding around them. "No mistake," Zoe said, her voice carrying the slightest edge that her twins didn't. "We paid for these seats, and we intend to enjoy them." Unlike her sister's measured tone, Zoe's words had a barely contained energy like a tightly coiled spring. Vanessa's smile never faltered, but her eyes hardened. "Of course. Enjoy your flight." She moved away to greet other boarding passengers with considerably more warmth, leaving behind a faint chill that had nothing to do with the cabin's temperature. The Horizon Airways first-class lounge at JFK International Airport had been the twins' first indication of what they might face. Though their boarding passes granted them full access, the hostess at the entrance had examined their credentials for an uncomfortably long time, flicking her eyes between the passes and their faces as if trying to spot a forgery. "Is there a problem?" Naomi had asked, her tone mild, curious, even as if she were merely collecting data. "No problem," the hostess had finally said, stepping aside to let them enter. But her smile hadn't reached her eyes. Inside the lounge had been a testament to luxury Italian leather chairs, a full bar with premium spirits, a spread of gourmet food attended by a private chef, and panoramic views of the runways. Most of the occupants were older white men in expensive suits, with a scattering of equally well-dressed white women. The twins had been the only black people in the space. They had chosen seats near the window, away from the bar, where conversations flowed freely among apparent regulars who seemed to know each other from frequent business trips. As they settled in, Naomi pulled out her tablet, reviewing notes for an upcoming neuroscience conference in Paris, while Zoe sipped sparkling water, her dark eyes taking in every detail of the room, every interaction, every subtle glance their way. "You feel it too, don't you?" Zoe had whispered to her sister after 20 minutes of being alternately ignored by the servers and stared at by fellow passengers. Naomi hadn't looked up from her tablet. Hypothesis: our presence disrupts their expectation of this space. Data points: extended credential verification service avoidance pattern, elevated observation from other occupants. Zoe had smiled at her twins' scientific approach to prejudice. "Only you would quantify discrimination. It helps to understand the variables," Naomi had replied with a small shrug. "Father always said knowledge is power only when it's measured correctly." Zoe had finished for her the twin speak that had been part of their language since childhood. The Jackson twins had been inseparable since birth, but anyone who knew them understood they were far from identical in personality. Naomi, older by 7 minutes, approached the world through the lens of her neuroscientific training, methodical, analytical, always observing before acting. Her research on cognitive bias and decision-making had earned her the directorship of the Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory at Harvard by age 28, making her one of the youngest research directors in the university's history. Zoe, by contrast, possessed a quicker trigger, a more immediate response to stimuli. Her brilliant mind worked in theoretical physics, specifically quantum field theory, where her ability to conceptualize complex interconnected systems had revolutionized understanding of subatomic particle behavior. Her position as the youngest tenured professor at MIT came after publishing 3 groundbreaking papers before she turned 27. But despite their different approaches to the world, the twins shared a core of steel forged by their upbringing. Alexander Jackson had raised his daughters to understand that excellence wasn't optional in a world determined to see them as less. After their mother died when they were 8, he had become both parents, balancing his growing shipping empire with bedtime stories and science fair projects. "The world will try to tell you who you are," he would say. "Your job is to show them who you choose to be." It was a lesson they carried through elite private schools, where they were often the only black students, through Ivy League universities where professors mistook them for scholarship cases, rather than the academically gifted students they were through early career challenges, where they constantly had to prove their brilliance in ways their white counterparts never did. By 30, both women had carved out spaces at the pinnacle of their fields, their names recognized in academic journals and at international conferences. Their journey hadn't been without obstacles. Naomi had once been mistaken for janitorial staff while working late in her own laboratory, while Zoe had been challenged about her presence at a faculty-only event, despite wearing her professor's identification badge. Each incident had been met with the composed dignity their father had taught them, and each had fueled their determination to excel, not just for themselves, but for those who would come after them. This trip to Paris had been planned for months, a surprise for Alexander's 65th birthday. He believed they were both deep in work commitments, Naomi supposedly finishing a major research paper on bias recognition patterns in medical diagnoses, and Zoe supposedly preparing for a prestigious lecture series in London. Instead, they would be appearing at the small villa he kept in Paris, where he was spending a rare vacation week. The Jackson family could have easily traveled on private jets. Alexander's company Quantum Logistics maintained a small fleet for executive use, but the twins had specifically chosen a commercial flight. Their decision wasn't about cost, but about principle. Alexander had always insisted they understand how the world operated for most people, not just the privileged few. Wealth is a tool, not an identity, he would remind them. Never forget to move through the world as a human, first a Jackson second, and wealthy a distant third. That philosophy had shaped them both. Naomi's research focused heavily on how socioeconomic factors influenced medical care decisions, while Zoe's theoretical work had practical applications in developing more efficient energy systems for underserved communities. Their substantial personal wealth, both from trust funds and their own successful careers, was largely channeled into foundations supporting young women of color in STEM fields. Now, seated in the first-class cabin of Horizon Airways Flight 792, that same philosophy kept them calm as Vanessa Miller's dismissive treatment continued during pre-flight service. The flight attendant managed to offer champagne to every other passenger while somehow overlooking them entirely, until Zoe finally raised her hand to get attention. "Excuse me, we seem to have been missed for the pre-flight beverage service," she said, her voice carrying just enough to ensure it couldn't be ignored. Vanessa turned that same practiced smile in place. "Of course. What would you like sparkling water with lime for me?" Naomi said. "Champagne," Zoe added. "The Veuve Clicquot you've been serving everyone else." A flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed Vanessa's face before she nodded and moved away to fetch their drinks. When she returned, she placed Naomi's water down without a coaster allowing condensation to drip onto her silk pants and handed Zoe her champagne with barely a glance. Deliberate, Zoe murmured after Vanessa had moved away. Noted, Naomi replied quietly, dabbing at the water spot with her napkin. Further data supporting the hypothesis. Around them, the first-class cabin continued to fill. A middle-aged white man in an impeccably tailored suit took the seat across from Zoe, glancing at her with poorly disguised surprise before busying himself with his phone. An elderly white couple settled into the row behind Naomi, the woman clutching her designer handbag a little tighter when she noticed who was seated in front of her. A younger Hispanic man took a seat several rows back, nodding politely to the twins when their eyes met briefly. As the final boarding announcements were made, Naomi and Zoe shared another glance. This trip was supposed to be a joyful surprise for their father, a rare opportunity for the three of them to spend time together away from work commitments and public obligations. Neither of them had anticipated that the journey itself would become a test of the principles Alexander Jackson had instilled in them. Principles of dignity, excellence, and the quiet power of knowing exactly who you are in a world determined to tell you otherwise. "Ready?" Naomi asked softly. "Always," Zoe replied with a small smile. Neither of them could have known then that in less than 2 hours their names would be trending on social media. Their faces would be on news broadcasts worldwide, and the entire Horizon Airways global fleet would be grounded, all because of what was about to unfold in this first-class cabin at 35,000 feet. The sleek Airbus A350 pushed back from the gate precisely on schedule, the gentle rumble of its engines vibrating through the premium cabin. Outside the window, JFK's Terminal 4 slowly receded from view as ground crew in fluorescent vests became tiny figures against the vast concrete expanse. Naomi watched with mild interest, her mind already calculating the variables of their interaction with Vanessa, filing away behavioral cues for future analysis. Across the aisle, Zoe scrolled through a scientific journal article on her tablet, though her attention wasn't fully on the complex equations displayed on screen. She was acutely aware of the sideways glances from Andrew Thompson, the businessman seated opposite her. His Brioni suit and Patek Philippe watch, both items she recognized from her father's collection, advertised his wealth more loudly than words could. The safety demonstration began with Vanessa standing at the front of the first-class cabin demonstrating oxygen mask procedures with practiced precision. Her gaze swept the cabin but seemed to skip over the twins entirely, as if the spaces they occupied were empty air. Selective attention blindness, murmured Naomi so quietly that only Zoe could hear. "She's literally trained her perception to exclude us from her conscious awareness. My field would call that a quantum impossibility," Zoe replied with equal quietness. "We occupy space. We affect the environment by our mere existence. She's choosing ignorance over basic physics." As the plane taxied toward the runway, Andrew Thompson finally broke his silence, leaning slightly toward Zoe. First time in first class, he asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Zoe turned to him with a pleasant but reserved smile. "No, though I typically fly private when traveling for lectures. The commercial experience can be refreshingly anonymous." The casual mention of private jets was not her usual style. Zoe generally avoided flaunting wealth, but something about Thompson's presumption required correction. His eyebrows lifted fractionally. "Lectures. What do you teach elementary school quantum field theory at MIT?" she replied simply. "I'm giving the keynote at the International Physics Symposium in Paris." Thompson's expression flickered between disbelief and reassessment. Before he could respond, the plane accelerated down the runway, pressing them all back into their seats as it climbed into the clear blue sky above New York. Once they reached cruising altitude, the cabin service began in earnest. Vanessa and her colleague, a younger flight attendant named Sarah, who seemed to be in training, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. Sarah approached the twins with a genuine smile. "May I offer you a hot towel?" she asked, extending a silver tray with steaming white cloths. "Thank you," Naomi replied, taking one and nodding appreciatively. As Sarah moved to Zoe, Vanessa suddenly appeared behind her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle the premier guests, Sarah. Why don't you check that the meal preparation is underway? Sarah looked momentarily confused, but nodded and retreated toward the galley. Vanessa then proceeded to offer hot towels to the remaining passengers, engaging them in friendly conversation about their destinations and comfort needs questions she hadn't bothered to ask the twins. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she said warmly to the businessman. "Heading to Paris for the finance summit. Your usual scotch after takeoff." "Thank you, Vanessa. You always remember." His smile was appreciative, the interaction clearly one between people who recognized each other from frequent trips. "Of course. It's important to take care of our loyal passengers." This last comment was delivered with just enough volume to carry to the twins' ears the emphasis on loyal, unmistakable. Zoe's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but Naomi caught at the subtle sign that her sister's patience was being tested. Under the small table between their seats, Naomi tapped twice on her armrest, their childhood signal for "let it go." Zoe gave the slightest nod in acknowledgement, returning her attention to her tablet. But the moment of tension had been observed by Miguel Ramirez, the young Hispanic man seated a few rows back. His eyes narrowed slightly as he watched the interaction unfold, his hand drifting toward the phone in his jacket pocket. The next 40 minutes passed in relative calm. Meal orders were taken. Vanessa somehow managing to reach the twins last, by which point the beef option they both preferred was, unfortunately, no longer available. Wine was served their glasses filled with noticeably less than other passengers received. Small but persistent slights accumulated like tiny paper cuts, individually minor but collectively telling. Then came the incident that shifted the energy of the entire cabin. Andrew Thompson stood to retrieve something from the overhead bin and accidentally knocked his glass of water onto Zoe's tablet. The device wasn't damaged, it was water-resistant, but the act itself was deliberate. His mumbled "sorry about that," undermined by the slight smirk that accompanied it. Zoe simply patted the tablet dry with her napkin, her expression neutral. No harm done. Though perhaps next time you might ask for assistance reaching the overhead bins if your spatial awareness is compromised. Thompson's face flushed. "Excuse me. Just a friendly suggestion," Zoe replied, her tone pleasant, but her eyes steely. "Coordination can decline with age. It's nothing to be embarrassed about." He stared at her for a moment, then returned to his seat without another word. But minutes later he pressed his call button. Vanessa appeared instantly at his side, leaning down to listen as he spoke in low tones, gesturing subtly toward the twins. She nodded several times, her expression growing increasingly concerned before straightening and approaching Naomi and Zoe. "Ladies," she began, her voice carrying a new note of authority. "I need to see your boarding passes again. There seems to be some confusion about seat assignments." Naomi calmly opened the airline app on her phone and displayed her boarding pass. 1A, as confirmed during boarding. Zoe did the same. 1C, also confirmed. Vanessa examined the digital passes with exaggerated scrutiny, then pulled out a tablet of her own. "That's strange. The manifest shows these seats should be occupied by..." She paused, looking pointedly at Thompson. "Other passengers. Premium frequent flyers." "The manifest is incorrect then," Naomi stated simply. "Our boarding passes are valid, our payment was processed, and our seats were confirmed both at check-in and at the gate." Vanessa's smile tightened further. "There might be a system error. These particular suites are generally reserved for our highest-tier members." "Are you suggesting we don't qualify for these seats?" Zoe asked directly. "I'm simply noting that there appears to be a discrepancy," Vanessa replied smoothly. "Perhaps you were upgraded accidentally. These things happen when the system misreads certain parameters." "What parameters would those be exactly?" Naomi's question was delivered with the same calm curiosity she might use when interviewing a research subject, but her eyes had sharpened. Vanessa faltered for just a second before regaining her composure. "Frequent flyer status, primarily. Mr. Thompson here, for instance, flies with us weekly and typically reserves 1B and 1C as a courtesy upgrade. Thompson nodded with exaggerated solemnity. I do prefer to have the extra space when traveling to Europe. Helps with my back condition. Zoe raised an eyebrow. How interesting that your back condition requires exactly the seat assigned to me despite there being 7 other empty first-class suites on this flight. A few rows back, the young Hispanic man Miguel Ramirez had quietly begun recording the interaction on his phone, keeping the device partially concealed behind a magazine. In the row behind Naomi, the elderly white woman leaned toward her husband, whispering something that made him frown and shake his head slightly. Vanessa reached for Naomi's phone ostensibly to examine the boarding pass more closely. As she did, her finger slipped, closing the app that displayed the boarding pass. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you pull that up again? I need to verify the confirmation code. Naomi reopened the app without comment, but Zoe's patience was visibly thinning. Is this standard procedure for all passengers or just ones who look like us? I beg your pardon. Vanessa's tone turned frosty. A simple question. I'm curious if Mr. Thompson's boarding pass received the same level of scrutiny, or if this special attention is reserved for passengers who don't fit your preconception of first-class travelers. Andrew Thompson interjected his voice, carrying the easy confidence of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. Now see here, there's no need to make accusations. Vanessa is just doing her job ensuring everyone is where they belong. And where exactly do you think we belong, Mr. Thompson? Zoe asked, her gaze steady. The businessman shifted uncomfortably. I simply meant I know exactly what you meant. Zoe cut in, her voice level but intense. Just as I know exactly what's happening here. Naomi, who had been silently observing this escalation, finally spoke. Vanessa, our boarding passes are valid. Our identities have been verified twice already, and there is no legitimate reason to question our presence in these seats. If you persist, we'll be forced to conclude that your actions are motivated by factors unrelated to airline protocol. Vanessa's face hardened. I don't appreciate what you're implying. I treat all passengers equally. Your behavior suggests otherwise, Naomi replied mildly. But we can easily resolve this. Please check our names against the passenger manifest again properly this time, and confirm our seat assignments with the gate agent who handled our boarding. For a moment, it seemed Vanessa might back down, but then she glanced at Thompson, who gave her a barely perceptible nod, and her resolve visibly hardened. She reached for Naomi's phone again, but this time when she handed it back, something was different. The boarding pass displayed on the screen had been altered. The seat number now showed 23F, an economy seat. As I suspected, Vanessa said with manufactured concern. There appears to have been an error during check-in. Your assigned seat is actually in the economy cabin. Naomi stared at the screen, then back at Vanessa, her expression unchanged but her eyes now radiating a cold intensity. This boarding pass has been tampered with. The seat number was 1A when I boarded, as verified by the gate agent, and by you during initial boarding. I'm afraid you're mistaken, Vanessa replied, her tone suggesting she was dealing with a confused child rather than a Harvard research director. Electronic boarding passes can be glitchy sometimes. If you check your sister's, I'm sure you'll find the same correction. Zoe, who had been watching this exchange with growing indignation, pulled up her own boarding pass, which now also displayed an economy seat number. This is fraud, she stated flatly. You've electronically altered our boarding passes, Thompson scoffed. That's a serious accusation against a respected airline professional. Maybe you ladies should consider that you made a mistake in reading your original assignments. We didn't, the twins said in perfect unison, their voices carrying that eerie synchronicity that had unnerved teachers and colleagues throughout their lives. The tension in the cabin had become palpable. Other passengers were now openly watching the confrontation, some with discomfort, others with curiosity, and a few like Miguel with growing outrage at what they were witnessing. Vanessa seemed to realize she had an audience and modulated her approach accordingly. I understand this is disappointing, but I'm going to have to ask you to relocate to your assigned seats in economy. Sarah will assist you with your belongings. No, Naomi said simply. Vanessa blinked clearly, not expecting such direct refusal. I'm sorry. We will not be moving, Naomi clarified. Our assigned seats are here as confirmed by our original boarding passes gate check-in, and the fact that we were allowed to board and sit here without issue until Mr. Thompson expressed his preference for my sister's seat. The elderly woman behind Naomi cleared her throat. Excuse me, but I saw their boarding passes during boarding. They were definitely seated in first class. Vanessa's smile became brittle. Mrs. Wilson, I appreciate your concern, but this is an airline matter that needs to be handled according to protocol. Andrew Thompson's expression had darkened. Look, I don't know what game you two are playing, but these premium suites cost thousands of dollars. They're not meant for... He caught himself, but the unfinished sentence hung in the air. For whom, Mr. Thompson? Zoe asked softly, dangerously. Please finish your thought. Thompson shifted in his seat. For people trying to game the system. For people who clearly don't travel first class regularly. Miguel Ramirez, still filming discreetly, muttered under his breath in Spanish, his disgust evident even to those who couldn't understand his words. Vanessa seemed to make a decision. She straightened her spine, her customer service mask slipping to reveal the steel beneath. If you won't relocate voluntarily, I'll need to involve the captain. Refusal to comply with crew instructions is a violation of federal aviation regulations. Naomi and Zoe exchanged another of their silent communications, a look that contained volumes of shared history and understanding. Then Naomi nodded almost imperceptibly. By all means, Zoe said, her voice carrying a calm certainty that seemed to unsettle Vanessa. Involve the captain. We welcome his assessment of the situation. Vanessa's eyes narrowed slightly before she turned and walked briskly toward the cockpit. In her absence, an uncomfortable silence fell over the first-class cabin. Andrew Thompson busied himself with his phone, though his reddened ears betrayed his awareness of the tension he had helped create. Several rows back, Miguel leaned forward. Hey, he said quietly to the twins. I got most of that on video. What she did with your boarding passes, that's messed up. Thank you, Naomi replied without turning around, though I suspect this situation is about to escalate further. Her prediction proved accurate. Less than 2 minutes later, Vanessa returned with Captain William Palmer, a tall man in his 50s with silver hair visible beneath his pilot's cap. His expression was grave as he approached the twins' seats. Ladies, he began, his tone professional but cool. I understand there's some confusion about seating assignments. Flight attendant Miller informs me that you're in seats reserved for other passengers and have refused to relocate to your assigned places in economy. There's confusion only because your flight attendant has fraudulently altered our boarding passes, Zoe replied evenly. We were assigned these seats, we paid for these seats, and we were permitted to board and occupy these seats without issue until she decided we didn't belong here. Captain Palmer frowned. That's a serious allegation. Vanessa is one of our most experienced crew members with an exemplary record. Experience doesn't preclude bias, Naomi observed. And records reflect only what's reported, not what occurs. The captain's frown deepened. I'm not here to debate social theory. I'm responsible for the safety and order of this aircraft, and right now you're disrupting both. With respect, Captain Naomi continued in her measured tone, we're seated calmly in our assigned spaces. The disruption began when your flight attendant, at the apparent behest of another passenger, she nodded toward Thompson, decided to challenge our right to be here despite all evidence to the contrary. Captain Palmer glanced at Thompson, who shrugged as if to say, Can you believe these people? Then he looked back at the twins. Look, I don't know what happened with your boarding passes, but Vanessa says the manifest shows you're assigned to economy. Given the discrepancy, I'm going to have to ask you to move to those seats for now. We can sort this out properly when we land in Paris. And if we decline? Zoe asked quietly. The captain's expression hardened. Then I'll be forced to divert this aircraft to the nearest airport and have you removed by security for interfering with a flight crew. I don't want to do that, but safety protocols are non-negotiable. Miguel Ramirez, still recording, spoke up. Captain, with respect, I've been filming this interaction. These women have been calm and reasonable while your flight attendant has been discriminatory and dishonest. I'd be happy to testify to that effect if this becomes a legal matter. Captain Palmer turned to Miguel with surprise and growing anger. Sir, unauthorized filming on this aircraft is also against regulations. I'll need you to delete that footage immediately. I'm aware of my rights, Miguel replied calmly. FAA regulations permit passengers to film as long as it doesn't interfere with crew duties or compromise safety. I'm doing neither. The captain's jaw tightened visibly. He turned back to the twins. Final warning. Move to your economy seats now, or I radio ahead for security to meet this plane. Naomi and Zoe shared another look, this one longer weighted with understanding. Then Zoe reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Before you make that call, Captain Palmer, she said, her voice steady, I think I should make one of my own. Captain William Palmer's expression shifted from authoritative to wary as he watched Zoe retrieve her phone. Cell phone use is prohibited while the aircraft is below 10,000 feet, or when the fasten seatbelt sign is illuminated due to turbulence, Zoe finished for him. Neither condition applies currently. I'm well within my rights as a passenger. The captain's mouth tightened into a thin line. Who exactly do you think you're calling? Someone who needs to be aware of the situation developing on this aircraft? Zoe replied calmly. Andrew Thompson let out a derisive laugh. What, your lawyer? Trust me, honey. Horizon Airways has an entire legal department that will bury whatever strip mall attorney you have on speed dial. Zoe didn't dignify his comment with a response, instead turning slightly toward her sister as she waited for her call to connect. Naomi maintained her composed expression, though her eyes never left Captain Palmer's face, noting every micro-expression with scientific precision. Vanessa Miller stood just behind the captain, her practiced smile now completely absent. Captain, perhaps we should simply have security waiting in Paris. Continuing this disruption isn't in anyone's interest. My thoughts exactly, Palmer replied, his eyes still fixed on Zoe's phone. Ladies, I'm giving you one final opportunity to comply peacefully. Move to your assigned economy seats, and we can resolve any ticket discrepancies upon arrival. Our assigned seats are these ones, Naomi stated firmly. Any discrepancy was created artificially after we boarded. We will not validate discrimination by complying with it. Meanwhile, Zoe's call had connected. Hello, Dad, she said, her voice clear and carrying in the tense cabin. I apologize for disturbing you, but there's a situation on our flight that requires your attention. The elderly couple seated behind Naomi exchanged concerned glances. The woman, Jennifer Wilson, leaned forward slightly, her earlier discomfort now mixed with something like sympathy. Young lady, she whispered, perhaps it would be best to just move. You can file a complaint later. Naomi turned slightly. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Wilson, but accommodating injustice never leads to its correction. At the same moment, Zoe continued her phone conversation. Yes, we're on Horizon Airways Flight 792 to Paris. Naomi and I are being told to vacate our first-class seats despite having valid boarding passes and confirmed reservations. She paused, listening. Yes, the original boarding passes showed seats 1A and 1C, but they've been electronically altered to show economy seating instead. Captain Palmer's expression darkened further. Miss, I need you to end that call now. You're interfering with crew member duties. I'm seated in my assigned seat making a permitted phone call, Zoe replied between listening to her father. That constitutes neither interference nor a safety hazard. Andrew Thompson, growing increasingly agitated, turned to the captain. This is ridiculous. Remove them and be done with it. Some of us have actual business waiting in Paris. Miguel Ramirez continued recording his phone, now held more openly as the situation escalated. For the record, he said clearly, these women have done absolutely nothing to justify removal. This is textbook discrimination. Vanessa spun toward him. Sir, you need to stop filming immediately or you'll also be reported for interference. I'm documenting a civil rights violation, Miguel replied firmly, and I'm well within my legal rights to do so. Meanwhile, Zoe had put her phone on speaker. Alexander Jackson's voice, deep and authoritative even through the small speaker, filled the immediate area. May I speak with the captain of the aircraft, please? Zoe held the phone out toward Captain Palmer, who hesitated before reluctantly taking it. This is Captain William Palmer. Who am I speaking with? Alexander Jackson, CEO of Quantum Logistics, and more relevantly at this moment, a 40% stakeholder in Horizon Airways Group. The color drained from Palmer's face. Andrew Thompson, close enough to hear the conversation, suddenly sat up straighter, his smug expression faltering. Mr. Jackson. The captain began, his tone markedly different. There seems to be some confusion regarding seating assignments. There's no confusion. Captain Alexander's voice was calm but carried an unmistakable authority. My daughters purchased first-class tickets, received first-class boarding passes, and were permitted to board and occupy first-class seats. Any subsequent discrepancy was created after the fact and without justification. Sir, I'm simply following protocol based on the information. Your information is incorrect, Captain Palmer. I'm looking at the original ticket confirmations right now, which clearly show seats 1A and 1C. I'm also receiving real-time updates on the electronic alterations being made to those records, which constitute fraud and a violation of FAA regulations regarding passenger manifest accuracy. Vanessa's face had gone pale. She leaned in to whisper something to Captain Palmer, who shook his head sharply, silencing her. Mr. Jackson Palmer tried again. I assure you that Horizon Airways does not discriminate against any passengers. If there's been a misunderstanding... This is not a misunderstanding. Captain Alexander interrupted, his voice, still measured but with an edge of steel beneath it. This is a documented pattern of behavior that my security team has been monitoring across your airline for the past 6 months. Today's incident is simply the most blatant example we've recorded. The first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Even Andrew Thompson seemed frozen in place, his earlier confidence evaporated. Now, Alexander continued, I expect my daughters to remain in their assigned and paid-for seats without further harassment. I expect any crew members involved in this incident to be immediately removed from service pending investigation. And I expect you, Captain, to personally apologize for your role in perpetuating discrimination aboard an aircraft bearing the name of a company in which I am a principal investor. Captain Palmer looked as though he'd been struck. Mr. Jackson, I wasn't aware. Clearly, your awareness will increase substantially in the coming hours. In the meantime, I suggest you focus on safely operating this aircraft while my team handles the broader implications of today's events. Vanessa stepped forward, her professional mask cracking to reveal panic beneath. Captain, we don't even know if this is really... It's him. Andrew Thompson interrupted, his voice hollow. I've seen Alexander Jackson at investor meetings. That's his voice. Captain Palmer handed the phone back to Zoe with visible reluctance. Mr. Jackson, I apologize for the misunderstanding. Your daughters will of course remain in their current seats for the duration of the flight. This isn't about their seats anymore, Captain Alexander replied, his voice now audible to most of the first-class cabin. This is about accountability. Expect further communication before you land in Paris. With that, the call ended. Zoe placed her phone on the console beside her seat and looked up at Captain Palmer expectantly. Naomi remained silent, her analytical gaze moving between the captain and Vanessa, documenting their reactions. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Then Captain Palmer cleared his throat. "Ladies, I apologize for the confusion regarding your seating. You are welcome to remain where you are. Can we offer you anything to make the remainder of your flight more comfortable?" "Actually, yes." Naomi spoke up, her voice as calm as if she were requesting a minor adjustment in a laboratory procedure. "We would prefer not to be served by Flight Attendant Miller for the remainder of this journey. Her behavior has demonstrated a clear bias that makes further interaction untenable." Vanessa's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "This is outrageous. I've done nothing wrong. Your electronic tampering with our boarding passes suggests otherwise," Zoe observed, "as does your preferential treatment of certain passengers and your targeted scrutiny of others, all of which I should note has been thoroughly documented." She nodded toward Miguel, who raised his phone slightly to indicate he was still recording. Captain Palmer's jaw worked as he visibly struggled with his response. Finally, he turned to Vanessa. "Return to the galley. Sarah will handle first-class service for the remainder of the flight." "Captain, you can't possibly—" "That's an order, Miller. Galley. Now." Vanessa's expression hardened, but she complied, turning sharply and marching toward the rear of the first-class cabin. As she passed Andrew Thompson, he avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the contents of the in-flight magazine. "Is there anything else you require?" Captain Palmer asked the twins, his tone professional but strained. "Just the respect and service any first-class passenger would expect," Naomi replied simply. "Of course. I'll be in the cockpit if you need anything further." With that, Captain Palmer retreated, his posture stiff with barely contained tension. As soon as he was gone, a low murmur of conversation broke out among the other passengers. Jennifer Wilson leaned forward again, this time with a very different expression. "I want to apologize," she said quietly to Naomi. "When I first saw what was happening, I thought it might be best not to make a scene. I was wrong. What they did was inexcusable." "Thank you, Mrs. Wilson," Naomi replied with a small nod. Silence in the face of injustice only serves to perpetuate it. Miguel Ramirez had stopped recording and now moved forward to the empty seat beside Naomi. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the seat. Naomi nodded and he sat down, lowering his voice. "That was incredible. Your father is Alexander Jackson." "The Alexander Jackson?" "Yes," Zoe confirmed from across the aisle. "Though we generally don't lead with that information." Miguel shook his head in amazement. "I work for a tech startup that uses quantum logistics for all our shipping. Your father's company revolutionized international supply chain management." He paused. "But more importantly, what they tried to do to you both was wrong on every level. I have the whole thing recorded if you need it for any reason." "Thank you, Miguel," Naomi said. "Though I suspect my father's team is already gathering all the evidence required." "What happens now?" he asked. Zoe glanced at her watch. "Now we continue our journey to Paris." "What happens after that?" She exchanged a look with her sister. "That depends on how quickly my father's team works." Neither twin could have anticipated just how quickly Alexander Jackson would act, nor how completely his response would transform not just their journey, but the entire landscape of commercial aviation. Back in the galley, Vanessa Miller was frantically typing on her phone, her hands shaking slightly as she sent urgent messages to Horizon Airways' corporate office. Her career flashed before her eyes: 27 years of service, multiple commendations, the comfortable retirement that had been just 5 years away, all potentially destroyed because she'd done what she'd always done, what had always been tacitly encouraged, ensuring that the right passengers received preferential treatment. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Palmer was on a secure line with Horizon's operations center, his voice low and urgent. I need to speak with the chief operating officer immediately. We have a situation involving Alexander Jackson's family members. Yes, that Alexander Jackson. Andrew Thompson sat rigid in his seat, his earlier arrogance replaced by a sickly pallor. As a senior investment banker who frequently facilitated deals with major corporations, he was acutely aware of Alexander Jackson's influence in global business circles. The realization that he had participated in discriminating against the daughters of one of the most powerful businessmen in the world, a man whose good graces had direct impact on Thompson's own career prospects, left him nauseated with dread. Throughout the first-class cabin, the atmosphere had shifted palpably. Passengers who had earlier averted their eyes or silently condoned the discrimination now seemed eager to distance themselves from it, some going so far as to make pointed comments about terrible service and unacceptable behavior loud enough for the twins to hear. Only the young flight attendant, Sarah, seemed genuinely horrified by what had transpired. When she approached to offer fresh drinks, her hands trembled slightly and her eyes were wide with distress. "I am so sorry," she whispered as she carefully placed a proper glass of champagne in front of Zoe. "I had no idea what Vanessa was doing. I would never have." "We know," Naomi interrupted gently. "Your behavior has been professional throughout. We don't hold you responsible for the actions of others." Relief washed over Sarah's face. "Thank you. Is there anything special I can get for you? Anything at all? Just the same service you'd provide to any passenger?" Zoe replied with a small smile. "No more? No less." As Sarah moved away, Naomi turned slightly toward her sister. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking? That our surprise for Dad just got significantly more complicated?" Zoe replied. "Absolutely. He didn't sound surprised to hear we were on this flight," Naomi observed quietly, "which suggests he already knew about our plans." Zoe smiled slightly. He always was 3 steps ahead of everyone else, even us. What neither twin realized in that moment was that their father was already more than 3 steps ahead. He was orchestrating a response that would reverberate through the airline industry for years to come, a response that had begun the instant he'd received Zoe's call, and that would reach its first dramatic crescendo long before Flight 792 touched down in Paris. 35,000 feet below in airport terminals across the globe, the first signs of that response were already becoming visible. At JFK, passengers queued at Horizon Airways gates were noticing their boarding passes suddenly displaying "delayed" in bold red letters. In London, Heathrow Horizon ground staff were staring in confusion at gate monitors that had abruptly switched from "on time" to "status pending." And in the Horizon Airways Global Operations Center in Atlanta, alarms were beginning to sound as system after system registered unauthorized access and executive-level overrides. The storm was gathering, and though they didn't yet know its full magnitude, the twins had just become the eye around which it would revolve. Zoe's phone lit up with a text message exactly 17 minutes after her call with Alexander ended. She glanced down at the screen, read the brief message, then passed the phone to Naomi. "It's starting," she said quietly. Naomi read the message, "System secured, operational override initiated, stand by for Phase 1, Team Quantum." With a small nod, she handed the phone back to her sister. Efficient as always. "He didn't become Alexander Jackson by half measures," Zoe replied, a hint of admiration in her voice. Miguel, who had returned to his original seat at the twins' suggestion, "Better for you not to be too closely associated with what's coming," Naomi had advised, was now watching a movie on his screen, though his attention periodically shifted toward the galley where Vanessa remained sequestered. Andrew Thompson had been unnervingly quiet since the revelation of the twins' parentage. He sat rigidly in his seat, periodically checking his phone with increasing agitation, as if waiting for the digital equivalent of a guillotine to fall. The first concrete sign of what Alexander had set in motion came approximately 40 minutes after Zoe's call. Captain Palmer's voice crackled over the intercom, the usual confident pilot's tone noticeably strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've just received information from our operations center that we may be experiencing some technical difficulties with our flight management system. As a precaution, we'll be holding at our current altitude and position while we perform some diagnostic checks. There's no cause for concern, and I'll update you as soon as I have more information." Naomi and Zoe exchanged a knowing glance as murmurs of confusion rippled through the cabin. For the next several minutes, nothing seemed to happen. The plane maintained its course and altitude. The cabin service continued with Sarah now handling all passengers, and the in-flight entertainment systems functioned normally. Then, one by one, passengers began noticing something odd. Anyone checking the flight status on their screens saw that their route had changed. Instead of proceeding on a northeastern path toward Paris, the flight path now showed a wide U-turn that would take them back to New York. A businessman 2 rows behind the twins was the first to speak up. "Excuse me," he called to Sarah as she passed with a tray of coffee. "My screen shows we're turning around. Are we heading back to JFK?" Sarah's brow furrowed in confusion. "I don't think so, sir. Let me check with the flight deck." Before she could reach the intercom, however, every screen in the first-class cabin suddenly went dark. Then seconds later, they re-illuminated. But instead of showing the usual flight information or entertainment options, each displayed the same image, the Quantum Logistics corporate logo, a stylized Q formed by interconnected dots representing a global network. "What the hell?" Andrew Thompson muttered, staring at his screen in disbelief. The logo held for 10 seconds, then dissolved into a video feed showing Alexander Jackson seated at a sleek desk, his distinguished features composed and authoritative. The silver in his close-cropped hair and beard caught the light, highlighting a face that graced the covers of business magazines with regular frequency, a face that bore unmistakable resemblance to the twins seated in 1A and 1C. "Good morning, Alexander," began his deep voice emanating from every speaker in the cabin. "I apologize for the interruption to your in-flight services. My name is Alexander Jackson, CEO of Quantum Logistics and significant stakeholder in Horizon Airways Group." The cabin had gone completely silent, all eyes fixed on screens as Alexander continued. "Approximately 53 minutes ago, my daughters Dr. Naomi and Dr. Zoe Jackson experienced blatant discrimination aboard this aircraft. Their validly purchased first-class tickets were questioned. Their boarding passes were electronically altered without consent, and they were threatened with removal from the aircraft, all because they didn't fit someone's preconception of what first-class passengers should look like." Alexander's expression remained composed, but his eyes reflected controlled anger. "This incident is not isolated. For the past 6 months, my security team has been monitoring a pattern of discriminatory practices throughout Horizon Airways operations practices that violate not only federal aviation regulations and civil rights laws, but basic human dignity." In the galley, Vanessa Miller had emerged, her face draining of color as she watched Alexander's broadcast. Captain Palmer's voice came urgently through the crew intercom, but no one was responding. As of 7 minutes ago, Alexander continued, "I have exercised my rights as a major stakeholder to initiate an emergency protocol within Horizon Airways. All flights currently in the air will continue safely to their destinations. However, no new Horizon Airways flights will depart until a complete operational audit has been conducted and all personnel involved in discriminatory practices have been identified and removed from service." Gasps echoed through the cabin. Andrew Thompson looked as though he might be physically ill. "Flight 792 is being rerouted to JFK, where federal authorities have been notified and will be conducting interviews regarding today's events. All passengers will be accommodated on alternative carriers to reach their destinations with minimal delay." Alexander leaned slightly forward, his gaze seemingly directed at each viewer individually. "To those who participated in, enabled, or silently condoned the discrimination my daughters faced today, this is not about revenge. This is about accountability and transformation. The world is watching, and the standards we uphold in moments of testing define not just our companies, but our society. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. To my daughters, who have handled this situation with the dignity and strength I've always known them to possess, your birthday surprise didn't quite go as planned, but I look forward to seeing you in Paris once this matter has been properly addressed. With that, Alexander nodded once and the screens returned to their normal flight information displays, which now clearly showed the aircraft beginning its turn back toward New York. The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers were on their feet, some demanding explanations from the visibly shaken Sarah, others furiously typing on their phones. Captain Palmer's voice came over the intercom again, his attempt at calmness belied by the strain in his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We have received instructions to return to JFK due to operational considerations. This is not a safety issue, but we need everyone seated for the course of adjustment." Andrew Thompson had finally found his voice. He leaned toward Zoe, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked desperation. "Look, this is a massive overreaction. I had nothing to do with what Vanessa did with your boarding passes. I just thought, it was a misunderstanding about the seating. Surely you can tell your father that." Zoe regarded him coolly. "What exactly should I tell him, Mr. Thompson? That you merely wanted my seat because you felt entitled to it? That you only implied we didn't belong in first class rather than stating it outright? That your discrimination was subtle rather than blatant? Which part of that do you think would appease him?" Thompson's face flushed. "You're ruining people's lives over a seating issue. Do you have any idea how many employees depend on this airline for their livelihoods?" "Actually, I do," Naomi interjected calmly. "Horizon Airways employs approximately 63,000 people worldwide, of whom roughly 76% have no involvement in customer-facing roles where discriminatory behavior could occur. Statistical analysis suggests that problematic behavior patterns are concentrated among 7 to 12% of staff, primarily those in positions of arbitrary authority with minimal oversight. She fixed Thompson with her steady gaze. "In other words, Mr. Thompson, the livelihood impact will be targeted rather than generalized. Those who have done nothing wrong have nothing to fear." "This is insane," Thompson muttered, slumping back in his seat. "All over a goddamn airplane seat." "No, Mr. Thompson," Zoe said quietly but firmly. "This was never about a seat. This was about human dignity and whether some people deserve less of it based on how they look. The seat was merely where that question was asked. The answer is what matters." At the rear of the first-class cabin, Vanessa Miller had collapsed into a jump seat, her face ashen. Sarah approached her cautiously. "Did you know," Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, "did you know who they were when you did all that?" Vanessa shook her head mutely, then found her voice. "It wouldn't have mattered. We're trained to accommodate our high-value customers. Thompson flies with us weekly, spends thousands. Those two, they didn't look like they belonged." Sarah stared at her in disbelief. "Because they're black. That's why you decided they didn't belong." "It wasn't just that," Vanessa hissed defensively. "It was everything, the way they dressed, how they carried themselves. They didn't have the look of our usual premium passengers." "What look is that exactly?" Sarah pressed, growing anger evident in her tone. "White, rich, entitled." Vanessa's eyes flashed. "You're new. You don't understand. There's a way things work. There's a natural order I understand perfectly." Sarah cut her off. "And I want nothing to do with it." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Vanessa alone with the ruins of her career. In the cockpit, Captain Palmer was engaged in a tense conversation with Horizon Airways Operations Center, his knuckles white as he gripped the radio handset. "What do you mean the flight control systems are locked?" he demanded. "Who authorized this executive override, Captain?" came the response, the voice on the other end sounding equally stressed. "It's not just your flight, it's the entire fleet. Every Horizon aircraft worldwide has been either grounded or ordered to return to its origin. Nothing takes off. Nothing diverts from its current course correction. The system's been locked down at the highest level. This is unprecedented. It has to be illegal. The legal team is scrambling, but preliminary assessment is that Jackson's stake in the company gives him the authority to initiate emergency protocols under certain conditions. Apparently, the discrimination incident qualifies." Palmer swore under his breath. "And the return to JFK. We're going to have a plane full of furious passengers. Federal authorities will meet the aircraft. All passengers will be rebooked on partner airlines. Jackson's team has already arranged it. And the crew." A pause. "You First Officer Davis and Flight Attendant Sarah Chen are to report to operations for debriefing. Flight Attendant Vanessa Miller is to be detained by air marshals pending investigation." "Detained?" Palmer's voice rose in disbelief. "On what grounds? Falsification of passenger manifests, fraudulent alteration of boarding passes, civil rights violations." The list goes on. "It's serious, William. This isn't just an HR issue anymore. The FBI's Civil Rights Division is involved." Captain Palmer fell silent, the full weight of the situation finally registering. "What about the passengers involved in the incident, Thompson and whoever else encouraged Miller? They'll be handled separately. Jackson's team has provided documentation showing this wasn't isolated. Apparently they've been building a case for months." In the main cabin, Naomi and Zoe sat quietly amidst the continuing chaos, their composure a stark contrast to the agitation around them. They had known their father long enough to understand that what they were witnessing was only the beginning, the visible portion of an iceberg whose true mass remained hidden beneath the surface. Miguel approached their seats again, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Your father just shut down an entire airline," he said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this." "He's not shutting it down," Naomi clarified. "He's resetting it. There's a significant difference. The distinction may be lost on people whose travel plans are being disrupted," Miguel pointed out. Perhaps Zoe acknowledged. "But sometimes disruption is necessary for true change. A temporary inconvenience weighed against a permanent improvement is a reasonable trade-off." Miguel shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You two really are his daughters, aren't you? Same way of thinking, big picture, long game." "We had a good teacher," Naomi replied with the barest hint of a smile. As the aircraft banked into its turn back toward New York, Sarah approached with fresh drinks for the twins. "I just wanted to say," she began hesitantly, "what's happening is... it's right. It needed to happen. The things I've seen since I started working here, the comments, the unwritten rules about who gets what kind of service, it wasn't okay." "Thank you, Sarah," Zoe said warmly. "People like you are exactly why this isn't about shutting down an airline. It's about making it better for everyone, passengers and employees alike." Andrew Thompson, overhearing this exchange, gave a derisive snort. "Spare me the corporate social responsibility lecture. Your father is flexing his power because his precious daughters got their feelings hurt. This is about ego, not equality. That's an interesting perspective from someone who tried to have us removed from our rightful seats simply because you wanted more space," Naomi observed coolly. "Tell me, Mr. Thompson, is projection a common feature of your psychological makeup, or is it specific to situations where your privilege is threatened?" Thompson's face reddened, but before he could respond, his phone chimed with an incoming email. He glanced down, then blanched visibly as he read the message. "Something wrong?" Zoe inquired, her tone innocent, but her eyes knowing. Thompson didn't answer, but his reaction told the story clearly enough. Whatever was in that email had struck home in a way that even the aircraft's reversal hadn't. What Thompson had just received, though the twins couldn't know the specific details, was a notification from his firm's compliance department informing him that effective immediately, he was suspended pending investigation into conduct unbecoming a senior partner and potential violation of the firm's non-discrimination policies. Attached was a video clip showing his behavior on Flight 792, along with a note that the footage had been provided by a concerned third party. Alexander Jackson's response wasn't limited to the airline. His influence extended into the interconnected worlds of global finance and corporate governance worlds, where reputation was currency and where principled stands could resonate far beyond their immediate context. As Flight 792 began its journey back to New York, the twins settled into a calm awareness that they were at the center of something far larger than a dispute over airplane seats. What had begun as discrimination against two passengers was evolving into a watershed moment that would force an entire industry to confront its unwritten rules, implicit biases, and the gap between its marketed image and operational reality. Naomi glanced out the window at the vast Atlantic passing beneath them, her analytical mind already processing the data points, identifying patterns, and anticipating outcomes. Zoe's thoughts ran along parallel tracks, seeing the interconnected systems, the cause and effect relationships that would ripple outward from this moment. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The shared understanding between them built over a lifetime of being not just sisters but intellectual partners made words superfluous. They had called their father expecting support. What they had received instead was a demonstration of what true accountability looked like when backed by both principle and power. The message Alexander had sent was clear, dignity was non-negotiable, bias had consequences, and transformation sometimes required disruption. It was a message the twins understood intimately, having been raised by a man who had never accepted the limitations others tried to place on him and who had taught his daughters to do the same. As the coastline of North America appeared on the horizon, Naomi finally broke the silence between them. Not quite the birthday surprise we had planned. Zoe smiled slightly. No. I think we can safely say this one's on him. Below them at JFK International Airport, a welcoming committee of a very different kind than they had anticipated was already assembling federal agents, corporate investigators, and a crisis management team dispatched by Alexander Jackson himself. The next phase was about to begin. The atmosphere in Terminal 4 at JFK International Airport crackled with tension as Flight 792 taxied toward its gate. News of what was transpiring had spread with viral speed across social media platforms and news outlets fueled by passengers on other Horizon flights sharing information about their sudden delays and cancellations. Hashtags like #Horizon Shutdown and #Jackson Twins were already trending globally. Inside the aircraft, Captain Palmer's voice came over the intercom one final time as they approached the gate. Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived back at JFK Terminal 4. When we reach the gate, we ask that you remain seated until further instructions are provided. Representatives from Horizon Airways and partner carriers will assist with rebooking your travel to Paris. We apologize for the inconvenience. The strained quality in his voice betrayed the inadequacy of the standard airline phrase for the unprecedented situation. Additionally, he continued after a brief pause. There will be federal authorities present in the terminal who may wish to speak with certain passengers and crew regarding events that occurred on this flight. Your cooperation is appreciated. As the plane docked at the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. The usual rush to disembark intensified by the unusual circumstances. Andrew Thompson had not spoken another word since receiving the email from his firm, his earlier arrogance replaced by a shell-shocked silence as he methodically packed his tablet and phone. Miguel Ramirez approached the twins one last time before they deplaned. I've uploaded the video to secure cloud storage and sent access links to both your email addresses, he said quietly. just in case it's needed. Thank you, Miguel, Naomi replied. Your willingness to document what occurred was significant. Some things need to be witnessed, he said simply. My abuelo always said that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit in it. Your grandfather was wise, Zoe noted with a smile. He worked as a janitor at a law firm for 40 years, Miguel explained. He wasn't educated in the formal sense, but he understood justice better than most of the attorneys he cleaned up after. He handed each of them a business card. If you ever need anything in the tech space, my startup would be honored to work with the Jackson family. The twins accepted his cards with genuine appreciation, and as the doors opened to allow deplaning, they hung back, allowing other passengers to exit first. They had been informed via text that representatives would meet them at the gate. When they finally stepped into the terminal, they were greeted by a striking scene. A cordon of airport security created a pathway through the crowded gate area. At the end of this path stood a tall black woman in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, her commanding presence drawing attention even in the chaotic terminal. Dr. Jackson and Dr. Jackson, she said as they approached, extending her hand. I'm Victoria Reynolds, Chief Security Officer for Quantum Logistics. Mr. Jackson asked me to escort you personally. Thank you, Ms. Reynolds, Naomi replied as they shook hands. Though I'm curious why Father felt security was necessary. Victoria's expression remained professionally neutral. It's not about security in the traditional sense. It's about optics and messaging. She gestured discreetly toward the terminal where dozens of passengers were recording with their phones and at least 2 professional news crews had set up cameras. Your experience has already become a symbol. Mr. Jackson wants to ensure the narrative remains clear and accurate. As Victoria led them through the terminal, Zoe noticed a group of serious-looking men and women in suits waiting near the gate where Flight 792 had docked. Some wore FBI jackets, while others were clearly Horizon Airways executives identifiable by their corporate pins and the looks of barely contained panic on their faces. Those are the federal agents Captain Palmer mentioned, Zoe asked quietly. Victoria nodded. Civil Rights Division primarily. Your father provided them with documentation of a pattern of discriminatory practices dating back 18 months. Today's incident was the catalyst, but not the cause. He's been building a case all this time. Naomi asked, her analytical mind quickly processing the implications. That suggests he anticipated something like this might occur. Mr. Jackson prefers to be prepared for all contingencies, Victoria replied diplomatically as she guided them toward a private airport lounge. Particularly when it comes to his daughters. The lounge was empty except for a distinguished-looking man in his 60s who rose as they entered. Richard Whitmore, CEO of Horizon Airways, looked as though he hadn't slept in days, despite the events having unfolded over mere hours. Dr. Jackson. Dr. Jackson. He began, his voice strained with forced politeness. On behalf of Horizon Airways, I want to express our profound apologies for your experience today. What happened was completely unacceptable and in no way reflects our company values or policies. Interesting, Zoe replied coolly, because it seemed to reflect your company's practices quite accurately based on both our experience and the documentation my father has apparently compiled. Whitmore's professional veneer cracked slightly. There may have been isolated incidents that weren't properly addressed. 47 documented cases in the past 18 months is not isolated. Mr. Whitmore. Naomi interjected. It's a pattern indicative of institutional bias. The CEO's face flushed. With all due respect, Dr. Jackson, you're a neuroscientist, not an aviation management expert. The complexities of running a global airline should never include tolerating discrimination. Victoria cut in sharply. Mr. Jackson was quite clear about his expectations for this meeting, Mr. Whitmore. Excuses and deflection weren't among them. Whitmore took a deep breath, visibly recalibrating his approach. You're right, of course. The incidents are inexcusable regardless of their frequency. I'm here to personally assure you that Flight Attendant Miller has been terminated effective immediately and Captain Palmer has been suspended pending review." "And Mr. Thompson?" Zoe inquired. "The passenger who initiated the complaint about our seating we haven't determined his status yet," Whitmore admitted. "He's a Diamond Elite member of our frequent flyer program with over 2 million miles. So discrimination is unacceptable unless the perpetrator has accumulated sufficient loyalty points." Naomi asked, her tone deceptively mild. "That's an interesting ethical calculation." Whitmore looked as though he'd swallowed something unpleasant. "That's not what I meant." "Then perhaps you should clarify your meaning," Victoria suggested, her tone making it clear this wasn't optional. "Mr. Thompson's status with Horizon Airways is under review," Whitmore amended hastily, "as are all aspects of our customer service protocols and training procedures." "A review you'll conduct yourself," Zoe pressed. Well, normally the executive team would oversee such a review." "Yes. The same executive team that allowed these practices to flourish in the first place," Naomi noted. "That seems problematic from both a methodological and ethical standpoint." Whitmore's professional mask was slipping further by the moment. "Look, I understand you're upset and you have every right to be. But shutting down our entire global operation is an extreme overreaction that's hurting thousands of innocent people who had nothing to do with your experience." First, Victoria interjected before either twin could respond. "The operation hasn't been shut down. All current flights will complete their journeys safely. Only new departures have been paused pending implementation of corrective measures." She fixed Whitmore with a steely gaze. "Second, this meeting was arranged so you could provide the Drs. Jackson with information about those corrective measures, not to debate the appropriateness of Mr. Jackson's response." "Which brings us to our primary question," Naomi said. "What specific, measurable steps is Horizon Airways prepared to take to address not just today's incident, but the underlying culture that enabled it?" Whitmore looked momentarily lost, as if the question itself revealed a gap in his preparation. "Well, we'll certainly implement additional sensitivity training for all customer-facing staff and review our customer service protocols to ensure sensitivity training has been empirically shown to have minimal impact on embedded bias patterns," Naomi interrupted. "And protocol reviews without structural changes merely create the illusion of progress." "What my sister is saying," Zoe translated, "is that superficial responses won't suffice. We're interested in substantive transformation, not public relations gestures." Whitmore's expression hardened. "With respect, Horizon Airways is a publicly traded company with responsibilities to shareholders and a board of directors. We can't simply overhaul our entire operation based on one incident, regardless of how regrettable it was." "One incident," Victoria's eyebrow arched dangerously. "Shall I enumerate the 47 documented cases Mr. Jackson's team has compiled, or perhaps you'd prefer to view the statistical analysis showing that black first-class passengers on Horizon flights are 8.3 times more likely to have their credentials questioned than white passengers with identical status?" Whitmore paled slightly. "I wasn't aware of those specific metrics." "That's precisely the problem," Zoe said firmly. "What you weren't aware of, or chose not to be aware of, directly impacted how your employees treated passengers like us." "This isn't personal," Naomi added. "It's about accountability and transformation. My father's response may seem extreme from your perspective, but it's proportional to both the severity of the problem and the apparent resistance to acknowledging it." Before Whitmore could respond, the door to the lounge opened and a team of 4 people entered, 3 men and 1 woman, all wearing Quantum Logistics identification badges. "Excuse the interruption," the woman at the front said, addressing Victoria rather than Whitmore. "Phase 2 is ready to implement. We need confirmation." Victoria turned to the twins. "This would be your father's team responsible for the operational aspects of the intervention. They're awaiting authorization to proceed with the next stage." Naomi and Zoe exchanged a glance. Then Naomi spoke. While we appreciate being consulted, we don't have sufficient information about Phase 2 to provide meaningful authorization. Of course, Victoria nodded. Benjamin, please brief the Drs. Jackson on the current status and next steps. Benjamin, a tall man with salt and pepper hair and the focused demeanor of someone accustomed to crisis management, stepped forward. As of 23 minutes ago, all Horizon Airways flights worldwide have been grounded or redirected as authorized under the emergency stakeholder protocols. The immediate operational pause has been executed without safety incidents. He tapped something on his tablet, which projected a global map onto the wall of the lounge, showing the status of every Horizon Airways aircraft worldwide, some safely at gates, others in various stages of return to their origins. Phase 2 involves the implementation of the remedial corporate governance protocols that Mr. Jackson's team has developed. In simple terms, it means replacing key personnel involved in either perpetuating or ignoring discriminatory practices, implementing new oversight mechanisms with real-time accountability measures, and establishing an independent review board to monitor compliance. Whitmore, who had been listening with growing alarm, finally found his voice. This is a corporate takeover disguised as a social justice intervention. The board will never. The board has already been notified. Benjamin interrupted calmly. As of 12 minutes ago, the chairman called an emergency session to review Mr. Jackson's evidence and proposed remedies. Given that Mr. Jackson controls 40% of voting shares and has the support of at least 2 other major stakeholders, the outcome is not in serious doubt. The CEO looked as though he might collapse. You're telling me the board is going to approve this hostile restructuring without even consulting executive leadership? The evidence suggests that executive leadership has been part of the problem, Victoria pointed out, which makes consulting them about the solution somewhat counterproductive. Benjamin turned back to the twins. To be clear, your authorization isn't technically required for Phase 2 implementation. Mr. Jackson has already initiated the sequence. He simply wanted to ensure you were fully informed and had the opportunity to provide input before the most visible aspects begin. And what are those visible aspects? Zoe asked. A public announcement of the leadership changes, effective immediately, Benjamin explained, including Mr. Whitmore's replacement as CEO. All eyes turned to Whitmore, whose face had gone from red to ashen in seconds. This is outrageous, he sputtered. I've given 15 years to this company, 15 years during which discriminatory practices became normalized within your corporate culture, Naomi observed. That's not a defense, Mr. Whitmore. It's an indictment. Victoria stepped forward. Mr. Whitmore, a car is waiting to take you to corporate headquarters where you'll be briefed on the transition process and separation agreement. I suggest you go quietly and cooperatively. Mr. Jackson has been exceedingly generous regarding financial terms provided there's no public resistance. For a moment, it seemed the CEO might argue further, but the fight visibly drained from him as the reality of his situation sank in. With a stiff nod, he allowed himself to be escorted from the lounge by one of the Quantum team members. As the door closed behind them, Benjamin turned back to the twins. With your approval, we'll proceed with the public announcement. Mr. Jackson thought you might wish to be present, but left that decision entirely to your discretion. Naomi and Zoe shared another of their silent communications, a lifetime of twin connection, allowing complex ideas to pass between them with the barest of glances. We'll attend, Naomi decided, but we prefer not to speak. This should be about structural change, not personal vindication. Understood. Benjamin nodded. The press conference is scheduled for 30 minutes from now in Concourse B. We've arranged for a quiet space where you can refresh and prepare if you'd like. As they were led to a private airport suite, typically reserved for visiting dignitaries, Zoe's phone buzzed with a text from their father. Proud of you both. This was never about the seats. It was about the world your children will inherit. See you in Paris tomorrow. Phase 3 is already in motion. Love, Dad. Zoe showed the message to Naomi, who nodded thoughtfully. Phase 3, she murmured. He really did plan for every contingency. That's Alexander Jackson, Victoria commented with a small smile. Always 3 moves ahead. What none of them fully appreciated in that moment was just how comprehensive Alexander's vision truly was. Phase 3 would go far beyond addressing one airline's discriminatory practices. It would fundamentally reimagine what air travel could be when built on principles of dignity, inclusion, and excellence from the ground up. As news of the Horizon Airways reset spread across the globe, stock markets reacted, industry analysts scrambled to assess implications, and social media exploded with commentary ranging from enthusiastic support to skeptical criticism. But through it all, 2 brilliant women at the center of the storm remained exactly as they had been on Flight 792, composed, dignified, and unwavering in their conviction that what they were witnessing wasn't destruction, but necessary transformation. The press conference, when it came, was a masterclass in controlled messaging. Benjamin presented the facts without embellishment. Horizon Airways had failed to address persistent discriminatory practices. Alexander Jackson, as a major stakeholder, had exercised his rights to protect both the company's long-term interests and its ethical obligations, and a new leadership team was being installed effective immediately to guide the airline through a period of substantial restructuring. Throughout the presentation, Naomi and Zoe sat quietly in the background, their presence a powerful statement that required no verbal elaboration. When reporters inevitably asked about their experience on Flight 792, Benjamin redirected attention to the broader pattern their treatment represented, not an isolated incident, but a symptom of deeper institutional failings. "This isn't about 2 passengers being mistreated," he explained firmly. "It's about an airline that lost sight of its fundamental obligation to treat all passengers with dignity and respect." Today marks the beginning of Horizon Airways' journey to rebuild not just its operations, but its core values. As cameras flashed and questions continued, the twins maintained their composed silence, allowing the focus to remain where it belonged on the necessary and overdue transformation of a company that had tolerated discrimination for far too long. What no one outside Alexander Jackson's inner circle knew was that the most significant part of his response was still to come, a Phase 3 that would reshape not just one airline, but the very concept of what air travel could and should be in a truly inclusive world. 3 days after the events of Flight 792, the Jackson twins arrived in Paris via a private quantum logistics jet. Their father had insisted on this arrangement despite their preference for commercial travel, noting wryly that sometimes making a point has to yield to practical considerations. Alexander was waiting for them at Le Bourget Airport, his tall figure unmistakable even from a distance. As they descended the aircraft stairs, he stood with hands in the pockets of his impeccably tailored suit, a rare smile softening his usually serious expression. "My brilliant daughters," he said as they reached him, opening his arms for an embrace that encompassed them both. "Certainly the most dramatic birthday surprise I've ever received." "That wasn't exactly how we planned it," Zoe replied with a laugh as they separated. "Plans change," Alexander said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Sometimes for the better." A sleek black sedan transported them to Alexander's Paris residence, a beautifully restored 19th-century townhouse in the 7th arrondissement, with views of the Eiffel Tower. As they settled into the elegantly appointed living room, Alexander's expression grew more serious. "I assume you have questions," he began, loosening his tie slightly, "about how events unfolded so quickly and why I was prepared to respond as I did. The timing suggests you anticipated something like this might happen," Naomi observed, her analytical mind as precise as ever, "which implies prior knowledge or at least strong suspicion of discriminatory practices at Horizon Airways." Alexander nodded, his expression grave. "It wasn't a matter of if, but when. My security team has been monitoring the situation for months." He rose and walked to an antique desk in the corner of the room, returning with a tablet. "This contains the full dossier we've compiled. I think you'll find it illuminating." For the next hour, the twins reviewed the extensive documentation Alexander's team had gathered passenger complaints that had been systematically buried internal communications revealing unwritten policies about passenger profiling. Statistical analyses showing clear patterns of discriminatory treatment and testimony from former employees who had either been silenced or forced out when they raised concerns. "This is far more extensive than I anticipated," Naomi said, finally, looking up from the tablet. The discrimination was essentially codified in their operational culture, albeit through informal channels rather than written policy. Precisely, Alexander confirmed. What you experienced on Flight 792 wasn't an anomaly. It was the system functioning as designed. Vanessa Miller wasn't a bad apple. She was a predictable product of a deeply flawed corporate culture. But why Horizon Airways specifically? Zoe asked, her mind making connections with characteristic quickness. You've never mentioned having concerns about them before, yet you acquired a substantial ownership stake. Was that specifically to position yourself for this intervention? Alexander's expression shifted to one of grudging admiration for his daughter's insight. Initially, no. My investment in Horizon was purely business. They had a strong route network, decent financials, and growth potential in emerging markets. But approximately 8 months ago, something caught my attention. He took a deep breath before continuing. I was flying Horizon to a conference in Singapore anonymously, as I sometimes do, to observe businesses I've invested in. I was seated in business class wearing casual clothes rather than my usual suit. Across the aisle was an elderly black woman who was clearly uncomfortable with the service settings and technology in her pod. His jaw tightened at the memory. Rather than helping her, the flight attendant spoke to her like she was a child, made comments to other passengers about some people not belonging in business class, and eventually suggested she might be more comfortable in premium economy. The woman was mortified, but too intimidated to object. "What did you do?" Naomi asked quietly. I intervened, of course. Identified myself, insisted on speaking with the purser, and made it clear that the behavior was unacceptable. The crew fell all over themselves, apologizing to me, notably not to the woman who had been mistreated. Alexander's eyes flashed with remembered anger. That's when I knew something was fundamentally wrong at Horizon. Not just an individual being prejudiced, but an institutional failure that allowed such behavior to flourish. I had my team begin investigating immediately. And that investigation revealed the pattern documented here. Zoe concluded, gesturing to the tablet. Yes. We found similar incidents across their global network, first and business class passengers of color, having their credentials questioned, being subjected to extra scrutiny, receiving substandard service, or being treated with subtle but unmistakable disdain. But you didn't act immediately, Naomi noted. You gathered evidence instead. Alexander nodded. I've learned that meaningful change requires more than righteous anger. It requires irrefutable evidence, strategic positioning, and precise timing. So we documented everything, increased my ownership stake to gain leverage, and prepared for the moment when direct intervention would be both justified and effective. And then we unwittingly provided that moment, Zoe said with a slight smile. Your experience on Flight 792 was the catalyst, yes, Alexander acknowledged, though I certainly didn't anticipate you would be the ones to experience such treatment. When you called it, changed the equation, made it personal in a way I hadn't expected. His expression softened as he regarded his daughters. I've spent your entire lives teaching you to stand firm in your dignity, to meet prejudice with excellence rather than rage. When I heard what was happening on that flight, I knew it was time to demonstrate what that principle looks like when backed by the full extent of one's influence and resources. The response has been significant, Naomi observed with characteristic understatement. Alexander's smile returned, though now it held a hint of the strategic calculus that had made him one of the world's most successful businessmen. Phase 1 and 2 were merely the foundation. The real work begins with Phase 3. The twins exchanged glances. "You mentioned Phase 3 in your text," Zoe said. "What exactly does it entail?" Instead of answering directly, Alexander asked a question of his own. What would an airline look like if it were built from the ground up, with dignity, inclusivity, and excellence as its core principles rather than afterthoughts? "You're not just reforming Horizon Airways." Naomi realized, her eyes widening slightly. "You're transforming it into something entirely new." "Horizon as it existed is finished," Alexander confirmed. "The name, the brand, the operational model, all of it will be retired. From its ashes will rise something better, something that could never have evolved naturally from the existing structure." "A complete corporate rebirth," Zoe mused, intrigued by the concept. "But surely the logistics of such a transformation are incredibly complex." "Complexity has never deterred me," Alexander replied with a hint of pride. "The operational aspects are already in motion. What I'd like, if you're willing, is your involvement in designing certain aspects of the new entity." This caught both twins by surprise. "Our involvement," Naomi repeated. "We're scientists, not airline executives," precisely, Alexander said with satisfaction. "Which makes you perfectly suited for what I have in mind." He turned to Naomi first. "Your work on cognitive bias and decision-making has direct applications to how service protocols are designed and implemented. Who better to create training programs that address implicit bias at its neurological roots rather than just its behavioral symptoms? Then to Zoe, and your understanding of complex systems theory could revolutionize how we structure operations to inherently promote equity rather than merely policing for discrimination after the fact." The twins considered this proposition communicating silently in the way that had mystified others throughout their lives. "We have academic commitments," Naomi said, finally. "Research teams, lectures, publications in progress, all of which can be accommodated," Alexander assured them. "I'm not asking you to abandon your careers. I'm suggesting you apply your expertise to a real-world laboratory with the potential to affect thousands of lives daily. Think of it as a consulting role with unusually high stakes." Zoe smiled slowly, the idea clearly appealing to her innovative mind. It would be an interesting application of theoretical principles to practical systems, and an opportunity to design evidence-based approaches to bias mitigation, rather than the superficial sensitivity training that dominates corporate responses, Naomi added, warming to the concept. "Exactly," Alexander confirmed, pleased by their engagement. "This isn't about creating another airline. It's about demonstrating that excellence and equity are complementary, not competing values. That treating people with dignity isn't just morally right, but makes sound business sense." The conversation continued long into the evening, shifting from philosophical principles to practical considerations, from broad visions to specific implementations. By the time they retired for the night, the outlines of what would eventually become Aurora Airways, named for the dawn of a new era in air travel, had begun to take shape. What none of them discussed explicitly, though, all understood implicitly, was that this transformation would face significant resistance. The aviation industry, with its established players and entrenched practices, would not easily welcome an upstart built on challenging the status quo. Alexander's reputation and resources would mitigate some obstacles, but others would require innovative solutions and steadfast resolve. The next morning, as they enjoyed breakfast on the townhouse's rooftop terrace with views of Paris awakening below, Alexander received a call from Victoria Reynolds. He excused himself to take it, returning several minutes later with a satisfied expression. "The board vote is complete," he announced. "Unanimous approval for the restructuring plan, including the complete rebranding and the appointment of the new executive team." "Unanimous?" Zoe questioned, surprised. "Even the members with ties to the old guard?" "Especially them," Alexander replied with a hint of satisfaction. It's remarkable how persuasive comprehensive documentation of legally actionable discrimination can be when presented alongside a viable alternative to public scandal, and the employees Naomi asked her concern for the human element characteristic of her approach to problem solving. What happens to them during this transition? All staff will be evaluated individually, not collectively, Alexander explained. Those without involvement in discriminatory practices, which is the vast majority, will be offered positions in the new structure, often with improved conditions. Those implicated in the documented incidents will be handled case by case with opportunities for retraining and rehabilitation where appropriate. He sipped his coffee before continuing. This isn't about punishment. It's about transformation. The goal isn't to destroy livelihoods, but to create an environment where everyone, employees and passengers alike, is treated with the dignity they deserve. As they discussed further details, Naomi's phone chimed with a news alert. She glanced at it, then showed the screen to Zoe and Alexander. The headline read, "Horizon Airways CEO resigns amid discrimination scandal. Jackson family behind massive aviation shakeup." "It's begun," Alexander said simply. "The public phase of the transformation. From here, things will move quickly." Indeed they did. Over the subsequent weeks, as the twins divided their time between their academic responsibilities and their new roles as consultants to what would become Aurora Airways, the aviation world watched in fascination as one of the industry's established players underwent a metamorphosis unprecedented in its scope and speed. Richard Whitmore, the former CEO, attempted to present his departure as a principled stand against hostile takeover tactics disguised as social justice initiatives. But his narrative gained little traction against the mountain of evidence Alexander's team had compiled and strategically released to selected journalists. Vanessa Miller faced both professional consequences and legal jeopardy with federal authorities investigating her actions for potential civil rights violations. Captain Palmer, after a thorough review, was offered a path to return to service conditional upon completing a comprehensive retraining program designed with input from Naomi's research team. Andrew Thompson, perhaps most dramatically affected of all the individuals involved, found himself not only banned from the airline, but also facing a career implosion as video of his behavior circulated within financial circles. His firm, initially content with a temporary suspension, made the decision permanent after clients began questioning whether someone with demonstrable bias should be handling their investments. But these individual stories, compelling though they were, ultimately became footnotes to the larger narrative of corporate transformation that was unfolding. The aviation industry, traditionally resistant to disruptive change, found itself confronting questions it had long avoided about accessibility, inclusivity, and the unwritten rules that determined who was made to feel welcome in premium spaces and who was not. As Alexander had predicted, the response from industry incumbents ranged from skeptical dismissal to outright hostility, with competitors quick to characterize Aurora Airways as a social experiment that would inevitably sacrifice operational excellence for political correctness. What they failed to understand, and what the Jackson family knew with certainty, was that the dichotomy was false. Excellence and equity weren't opposing values requiring careful balance. They were complementary principles that, when properly integrated, created something stronger and more sustainable than either could achieve alone. This fundamental insight would guide the development of Aurora Airways through the challenges ahead. Challenges that would test not just the operational model the Jacksons were creating, but the very premise that an institution built on dignity could thrive in an industry that had too often treated it as an optional luxury rather than a fundamental requirement. 6 weeks after the events of Flight 792, a select group of aviation industry executives, regulatory officials, and media representatives gathered in a sleek conference center overlooking Manhattan's Hudson River. The invitation, bearing only the enigmatic Aurora logo, a stylized sunrise composed of interconnected golden dots, had provided minimal details beyond time, location, and a brief note, "Witness the dawn of a new era in air travel." Speculation had run rampant in industry circles. Some believed Alexander Jackson was launching an entirely new airline. Others suspected a technology platform designed to monitor discrimination across existing carriers. Still others thought it might be merely a PR exercise to capitalize on the Horizon Airways controversy that had dominated headlines for weeks. None had accurately predicted the full scope of what was about to be revealed. The lights dimmed precisely at 10:00 a.m., and Alexander Jackson stepped onto the stage impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit that managed to project both authority and accessibility. He stood silently for a moment, allowing the anticipation to build before speaking. "Good morning," he began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the hushed space. "Thank you for joining us for what I believe will be remembered as a pivotal moment in aviation history." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the assembled audience. "6 weeks ago, my daughters experienced discrimination aboard a Horizon Airways flight discrimination that proved to be not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern embedded in the company's operational culture. The response to that incident has been extensively documented in the press, so I won't rehash those details today." Behind him, a large screen illuminated with images from the aftermath news headlines, social media reactions, and brief video clips of the industry's tumultuous response. What hasn't been reported and what we're here to announce today is what comes next. Not just for one airline, but potentially for the industry as a whole. The screen shifted to show the Aurora logo larger now and slowly rotating to reveal its three-dimensional complexity. Today marks the official launch of Aurora Airways, not merely a rebranded Horizon, but a fundamentally reimagined approach to air travel built on three core principles: dignity as a non-negotiable right for all passengers and employees, excellence as the only acceptable standard for service and operations, and innovation as the means to harmonize these principles rather than treating them as competing priorities. Alexander stepped aside as the screen behind him expanded to show a comprehensive visualization of Aurora's business model, operational structure, and service philosophy. For the next 20 minutes, he outlined a vision so ambitious it bordered on revolutionary, a complete rethinking of everything from crew training protocols to cabin design, from booking algorithms to customer service recovery procedures. But vision without execution is merely hallucination, Alexander acknowledged, transitioning to the next phase of his presentation. Which is why I've assembled a team uniquely qualified to transform this concept into reality. The screen changed again to show portraits of the executive leadership team, a diverse group of aviation veterans and innovators from outside the industry, each with specific expertise relevant to Aurora's mission. Leading this team as Chief Executive Officer, Alexander continued, is someone whose experience, integrity, and vision make her uniquely qualified to guide Aurora through its formative stages. Please welcome Dr. Elena Morales. A woman in her early 50s walked onto the stage with confident grace. Her salt and pepper hair was cut in a practical bob, and her eyes conveyed both warmth and unmistakable intelligence. As former commissioner of the Federal Aviation Administration and a respected expert in aviation safety and regulatory compliance, her appointment sent an immediate message about Aurora's commitment to operating at the highest standards. "Thank you, Alexander Dr." Morales said as she took the podium. "When Mr. Jackson approached me about leading Aurora Airways, my initial response was skepticism. The aviation industry is notoriously resistant to disruptive change, and the challenges of transforming an existing airline while simultaneously reimagining its fundamental approach seemed daunting at best, impossible at worst." She smiled slightly. "But then I reviewed the evidence his team had compiled, studied the proposed operational model, and recognized that this wasn't just another corporate rebranding exercise. This was an opportunity to address long-standing issues that the industry has consistently failed to confront directly." For the next 15 minutes, Dr. Morales detailed the practical aspects of Aurora's launch plan: the phased reintroduction of routes, the comprehensive retraining program for retained staff, the technological infrastructure being developed to support the new service model and the rigorous metrics that would be used to measure success beyond traditional financial indicators. But perhaps the most innovative aspect of Aurora's approach, she continued, is the integration of scientific principles into our operational design. For that element of our transformation, I'd like to introduce two consultants who have been instrumental in developing key components of the Aurora model, Dr. Naomi Jackson and Dr. Zoe Jackson. The twins walked onto the stage together, their professional demeanor masking any nervousness they might have felt at addressing such a high-profile gathering. They were dressed in complementary outfits, Naomi in a tailored navy pantsuit, Zoe in a structured charcoal dress that subtly reinforced their individual identities while highlighting their connection. Naomi spoke first, her voice carrying the measured precision that characterized her academic presentations. My research focuses on cognitive bias and decision-making processes, specifically how our brains form and maintain bias patterns, and more importantly, how those patterns can be effectively modified rather than simply suppressed. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a visualization of neural pathways. Traditional sensitivity training fails because it addresses conscious attitudes while leaving underlying neural patterns intact. At Aurora, we've developed a training protocol that targets these foundational patterns through consistent behavioral reinforcement coupled with structural systems that prevent bias expression. Zoe picked up seamlessly where her sister left off. From a systems perspective, discrimination occurs not just because of individual bias, but because operational structures enable its expression. By applying principles from complex adaptive systems theory, we've designed Aurora's operational framework to inherently promote equity rather than merely attempting to police discrimination after it occurs. Together, they outlined the scientific foundation of Aurora's approach, a methodology grounded in empirical research rather than corporate platitudes or performative inclusion efforts. As they concluded their presentation and returned to their seats, the audience's reaction was mixed, some clearly intrigued by the innovative approach, others visibly skeptical of its practical application. Dr. Morales returned to the podium. I recognize that what we've presented today represents a significant departure from industry norms. Some of you are undoubtedly wondering whether an airline built on these principles can compete effectively in a market driven primarily by cost considerations and schedule convenience. She smiled confidently. That's the question we're most eager to answer. Aurora Airways will begin operations in exactly 1 month with an initial route network connecting 12 major global destinations. Every aspect of the passenger experience has been reimagined, from booking interface to baggage handling, from cabin service to complaint resolution. Alexander rejoined her on stage for the final portion of the presentation. Aurora isn't merely a response to a single incident of discrimination, he emphasized. It's a demonstration that excellence and equity are not competing values but complementary strengths. That treating all people with dignity isn't just morally right, but makes sound business sense. He paused, his expression intensifying. Some will dismiss this as idealism ill-suited to the practical realities of the airline industry. To them I say, watch what happens when passengers experience an environment designed to value them as individuals, rather than simply process them as inventory. Watch what happens when employees are empowered to provide exceptional service, rather than merely enforce rigid protocols. The presentation concluded with a timeline for Aurora's launch and an announcement that would prove especially significant in the weeks ahead. The airline would begin accepting reservations for its inaugural flights the following day, allowing the market to render its initial verdict on whether the concept had genuine appeal beyond industry insiders and social activists. As the attendees filed out of the conference center, some energized by the vision presented, others dismissive of its viability. None could have predicted how dramatically Aurora Airways would exceed even Alexander Jackson's ambitious expectations. The reservation system, designed to handle what Aurora's team projected, would be modest initial demand crashed within hours of going live as hundreds of thousands of potential passengers attempted to secure seats on the inaugural flights. When the system was restored and stabilized 24 hours later, the first month of flights had sold out entirely across all service classes. More revealing than the raw numbers was the demographic composition of these early bookings. Aurora had attracted not just socially conscious travelers making a values-based choice, but business travelers, luxury vacationers, and budget-conscious families, a cross-section that suggested the appeal of dignity as a core service principle transcended traditional market segmentation. Behind the scenes, the transformation of former Horizon Airways assets into Aurora's new operational infrastructure proceeded with the precision characteristic of Alexander Jackson's ventures. Aircraft were being reconfigured according to designs that eliminated the subtle hierarchies embedded in traditional cabin layouts while maintaining clear service differentiation. Crew members were undergoing the innovative training programs developed by Naomi's team, and operational systems were being rebuilt from the ground up based on Zoe's complex systems approach. Not every aspect of the transition proceeded smoothly. Former Horizon executives launched legal challenges to various elements of the restructuring. Industry incumbents whispered to investors about Aurora's supposed impracticality. Aviation analysts questioned whether an airline distracted by social concerns could maintain the operational discipline required for profitability. Through it all, the Jackson family and their assembled team maintained unwavering focus on executing the vision they had articulated. Alexander, drawing on decades of experience navigating corporate transformations, had anticipated most of the resistance they encountered and had prepared contingencies that frequently turned opposition into unexpected opportunities. When former Horizon executives filed a lawsuit challenging the reallocation of landing slots, Aurora's legal team countered with evidence that the previous allocation system had demonstrably favored routes serving predominantly white affluent communities, a revelation that prompted a broader regulatory review of slot assignment practices industry-wide. When competitors attempted to poach key personnel by spreading rumors about Aurora's financial stability, Alexander simply accelerated the employee ownership program that had been planned for later implementation, giving staff members equity stakes that aligned their interests directly with the airline's success. 8 weeks after the announcement, with Aurora's launch just days away, the twins met with their father at Quantum Logistics' New York headquarters to review final preparations. The conference room overlooking Central Park was filled with progress reports, design mock-ups, and real-time data feeds showing the status of various implementation teams. The crew training completion rate is at 94%. Naomi reported, reviewing the latest figures. The neurological assessment metrics are showing significant shifts in implicit bias patterns, particularly among staff retained from Horizon, and the operational systems integration is proceeding on schedule, Zoe added. The adaptive feedback loops we designed are already identifying and correcting potential points of service failure before they manifest. Alexander nodded with satisfaction. And advance bookings, exceeding projections by 310%, Zoe confirmed. More significantly, customer demographic data shows unprecedented diversity across all service classes. The real test begins when actual service commences. Naomi cautioned her scientific training, making her naturally resistant to premature conclusions. Conceptual support doesn't always translate to operational success. True, Alexander acknowledged, but we've built something that addresses a real need rather than merely creating artificial demand. That makes all the difference. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the park as afternoon shadows lengthened across the greenery. When I was building Quantum Logistics, people told me my approach was too principled to succeed in a cutthroat industry, that insisting on ethical supply chains and fair labor practices would put us at a competitive disadvantage. He turned back to face his daughters. They were wrong then, just as Aurora's skeptics are wrong now. Excellence doesn't require compromise on fundamental values. In fact, it's often impossible to achieve without them. 3 days later, Aurora Airways' first official flight from New York to London departed JFK International Airport. At the controls was Captain William Palmer, the same pilot who had initially supported Vanessa Miller's discrimination against the twins. His presence was no accident but a deliberate choice, part of Aurora's commitment to rehabilitation rather than mere punishment. Palmer had completed the comprehensive retraining program designed by Naomi's team, confronting his own biases with sometimes painful honesty and emerging as one of the program's strongest advocates. His journey from unwitting enabler to conscious ally was exactly the kind of transformation Aurora sought to facilitate on an institutional scale. As the Airbus A350, now repainted in Aurora's distinctive sunrise livery, lifted into the dawn sky, it carried more than just passengers and cargo. It bore the weight of a bold hypothesis that an airline built on principles of dignity, excellence, and innovation could not just survive, but thrive in an industry that had too often treated these values as optional luxuries rather than essential foundations. The results of this experiment would unfold in the months ahead, revealing whether Alexander Jackson's vision represented a momentary disruption or the beginning of a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry approached its relationship with both passengers and employees. What was already clear, however, was that the incident on Flight 792 had catalyzed something far larger than anyone involved could have anticipated: a reconsideration of the unwritten rules that had long governed who was made to feel welcome in premium spaces and who was forced to continually justify their presence. For Naomi and Zoe Jackson, the transformation they were helping to guide represented the practical application of principles their father had instilled in them since childhood: that dignity was non-negotiable, that excellence was the most effective response to prejudice, and that true change required not just identifying problems, but actively building better alternatives. As Aurora Airways took flight carrying these principles into the competitive skies of global aviation, the twins returned to their academic positions with new perspective on how their theoretical work could find practical application in reshaping institutional structures that had long seemed resistant to meaningful change. The journey that had begun with their mistreatment on Flight 792 had evolved into something neither punishment nor revenge, but something far more powerful and enduring: a demonstration that another way was possible, not just in aviation, but in any industry where dignity had been treated as a privilege rather than a right. 6 months after Aurora Airways' inaugural flight, the transformation that had begun with a single incident of discrimination had evolved into a phenomenon that was reshaping expectations across the aviation industry. What competitors had dismissed as idealistic experimentation had proven itself not merely viable, but increasingly dominant in key metrics that defined airline success. In a sleek conference room at Aurora's newly established headquarters, a LEED-certified building whose architecture reflected the company's commitment to both environmental and social sustainability, the leadership team had gathered for their quarterly review. The walls displayed real-time data visualizations, tracking everything from customer satisfaction scores to employee retention rates, from operational efficiency metrics to financial performance indicators. Dr. Elena Morales, now firmly established as Aurora's CEO, stood before the assembled executives, her characteristic blend of analytical precision and visionary leadership evident in her demeanor. 6 months ago, many industry analysts predicted our failure. She began gesturing toward a screen showing excerpts from skeptical assessments published prior to Aurora's launch. They argued that our emphasis on dignity and inclusion would inevitably compromise operational excellence and financial performance. She clicked to the next slide, which displayed Aurora's current performance metrics compared to industry averages. The data tells a different story. Customer satisfaction is 42% above industry average across all service classes. On-time performance has improved by 17% quarter over quarter. Employee retention is at 96% compared to the industry average of 78%. Alexander Jackson, seated at the conference table as chairman of Aurora's board, nodded with satisfaction, but not surprise. The metrics confirmed what he had always believed, that treating people with dignity, both passengers and employees, created a foundation for exceptional performance rather than hindering it. Most significantly, Dr. Morales continued, our financial performance has exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Revenue per available seat mile is 23% above forecast, while cost per available seat mile is 7% below budget. She clicked to a slide showing Aurora's market share growth across key routes. We're not just attracting passengers who make choices based on social values. We're gaining market share across all traditional customer segments, from budget travelers to premium business clients. The presentation continued with detailed breakdowns of various operational aspects, from the innovative cabin designs that had eliminated subtle status hierarchies while maintaining service differentiation to the transparent pricing model that had disrupted industry norms around fare structures and ancillary fees. Throughout the review, Naomi and Zoe Jackson, present as consulting advisors rather than operational executives, listened with professional interest. Their contributions to Aurora's transformation had been foundational, but both had maintained their primary academic careers while providing ongoing guidance to the implementation teams. When the formal presentation concluded and discussion opened, Naomi leaned forward slightly. The neural adaptation metrics from the crew training program are particularly encouraging, she noted. We're seeing sustained behavioral changes rather than the temporary compliance typical of traditional sensitivity training approaches, agreed Dr. Morales responded. The program your team designed has fundamentally altered how our staff approach service interactions. They're making decisions based on genuine respect rather than procedural compliance. Zoe added her perspective on the operational systems. The adaptive feedback mechanisms are functioning as intended. When service failures occur, as they inevitably will in any complex system, they're being identified and addressed before they can become embedded patterns. Alexander observed the discussion with quiet pride. 6 months earlier, skeptics had dismissed Aurora's approach as performative idealism ill-suited to the practical realities of the airline business. Now the same critics were scrambling to understand and potentially replicate elements of the model that had proven so unexpectedly successful. As the meeting progressed to discussions of expansion plans and strategic priorities, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. What had begun as a response to discrimination had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of what air travel could be when built on fundamentally different assumptions about the relationship between dignity and excellence. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The early months had seen operational hiccups as new systems were implemented and staff adjusted to radically different expectations. Industry incumbents had attempted to undermine Aurora through pricing strategies and targeted marketing campaigns. Former Horizon executives continued to criticize the restructuring in industry forums and financial media. Yet Aurora had not merely survived these challenges, but thrived because of them, using each obstacle as an opportunity to demonstrate the robustness of its approach. When competitors slashed fares on overlapping routes, Aurora responded not with matching cuts, but with enhanced service value that justified its pricing. When criticism appeared in industry publications, Aurora invited the authors to experience its service firsthand, often converting skeptics into reluctant admirers. Most significantly, Aurora had begun to influence behavior beyond its own operations. Competitors were hastily introducing elements that mimicked Aurora's approach: more transparent pricing models, revised service recovery protocols, enhanced crew training programs. While these changes were often superficial adaptations rather than fundamental restructuring, they nonetheless represented tacit acknowledgement that Aurora had identified genuine weaknesses in traditional airline operating models. After the quarterly review concluded, Naomi and Zoe accompanied their father to his private office for a more personal discussion of Aurora's progress and future direction. The neurological adaptation program is ready for broader implementation, Naomi explained as they settled into comfortable chairs overlooking the airport where Aurora's distinctive aircraft now formed a growing presence. We've refined the methodology based on the initial 6 months of data, and the results are even more promising than our initial projections. And the operational systems have achieved stability with minimal manual intervention, Zoe added. The self-correcting algorithms are now identifying potential service failures before they manifest, often without requiring human oversight. Alexander nodded thoughtfully, both of which suggest we're ready for the next phase of expansion. The question is whether to accelerate route development or focus on deepening service quality on existing routes. The complex systems analysis suggests a balanced approach, Zoe offered. Too rapid expansion risks diluting the service model before it's fully embedded. Too slow growth fails to capitalize on current market advantage. I'm more concerned with ensuring the neurological adaptations have time to fully integrate before introducing new variables. Naomi countered her scientific caution, evident. Behavioral changes can appear stable but revert under pressure if not fully consolidated. Alexander listened to his daughter's perspectives with genuine respect for their expertise. This consultative approach, drawing on specialized knowledge rather than relying solely on industry experience, was itself a departure from traditional airline management practices and one of Aurora's key competitive advantages. We'll proceed with measured expansion, he decided after considering their input, adding routes strategically while maintaining absolute commitment to service quality. Elena and her team have identified key markets where demand for our model is particularly strong. The conversation shifted to broader implications of Aurora's approach, how the principles being demonstrated in aviation might apply to other industries where discrimination remained embedded in operational cultures, from hospitality to healthcare, from financial services to retail. What we're proving isn't specific to airlines, Zoe observed. It's that institutions built on dignity rather than merely policed for discrimination function more effectively across virtually all metrics, and that addressing bias at its cognitive and structural roots produces more sustainable change than superficial compliance efforts, Naomi added. Alexander smiled at the familiar symmetry of their thinking distinct perspectives that nonetheless complemented each other perfectly. Exactly why I wanted your involvement from the beginning. This was never just about correcting one airline's failings. It was about demonstrating a better model that others might eventually adopt. As twilight descended outside the windows, the conversation continued, touching on Aurora's expanding influence in regulatory discussions, its impact on industry hiring practices, and its role in challenging long-standing assumptions about the economics of air travel. Throughout, the underlying theme remained consistent. What had begun as a response to injustice had evolved into an affirmative vision of how institutions could function when built on fundamentally different principles. 8 months after Aurora's launch, the airline reached another significant milestone, the introduction of its first completely new aircraft rather than retrofitted Horizon Airways planes. The delivery ceremony for the first of 20 next-generation Airbus A321XLR aircraft represented not just fleet expansion but the opportunity to implement Aurora's principles in every aspect of aircraft design from the beginning. The new plane featured cabin architecture, developed with input from behavioral psychologists to promote positive interactions. Seating configured to eliminate status friction points while maintaining appropriate service differentiation, and environmental systems designed to reduce the physiological stress that often exacerbated interpersonal tensions during air travel. As industry observers and media representatives toured the aircraft during its unveiling ceremony, many expressed surprise at features that seemed obvious in retrospect, but represented significant departures from industry norms, design choices that reduced anxiety, enhanced comfort across all service classes, and facilitated more natural interactions between passengers and crew. The traditional approach to aircraft interiors has been to emphasize status differentiation between service classes, explained Aurora's Chief Experience Officer during the media briefing. Our approach instead focuses on appropriate service differentiation without status hierarchy. First-class passengers still receive premium service commensurate with their fare, but not in ways that diminish the essential dignity of economy passengers. This nuanced distinction between service differentiation and status hierarchy encapsulated Aurora's fundamental innovation. The airline had not eliminated business and first-class offerings nor homogenized service across fare categories. Instead, it had reimagined how different service levels could be delivered without the subtle and sometimes overt signals that some passengers were more valued as human beings than others. In practical terms, this meant business-class passengers still enjoyed larger seats and enhanced meal options, but flight attendants addressed all passengers with the same level of respect. Premium check-in counters still provided expedited processing for higher-fare passengers, but without the velvet ropes and physical barriers that turned efficiency measures into status symbols. Service recovery protocols still provided enhanced compensation for higher fare tickets when disruptions occurred, but ensured that all passengers received appropriate care regardless of ticket class. These distinctions might have seemed subtle to casual observers, but they fundamentally altered the emotional dynamics of air travel, eliminating the tension that arose when service differences were presented as reflections of passenger worth, rather than simply different products at different price points. The success of this approach was evident in Aurora's customer satisfaction metrics, which showed unprecedented levels of approval across all service classes. Premium passengers reported feeling less guilt and defensiveness about their chosen service level, while economy passengers reported feeling more valued and respected despite choosing lower-priced options. This psychological reframing of the air travel experience represented perhaps Aurora's most significant innovation, one that competitors could mimic in superficial ways but struggled to fully replicate because it required not just procedural changes, but fundamental shifts in organizational culture and operating assumptions. As Aurora approached its one-year anniversary, the airline had grown from its initial 12 routes to 37, serving 23 countries across 4 continents. Its fleet had expanded from the original Horizon aircraft to include new planes specifically designed for Aurora's service model. Its workforce had increased from 8,000 to 11,500 with employee satisfaction scores that led the industry by significant margins. Most remarkably, Aurora had achieved this growth while maintaining consistently high standards across all operational metrics, proving that its approach was not merely idealism made possible by limited scale, but a viable model for a major global carrier. The transformation that had begun with 2 black women being discriminated against on Flight 792 had evolved into something far beyond a corrective response to a single incident. Aurora Airways had become a living demonstration that excellence and equity were not competing values requiring careful balance, but complementary principles that, when properly integrated, created something stronger and more sustainable than either could achieve alone. This fundamental insight that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right but made sound business sense was Aurora's most profound contribution to an industry that had too often assumed the opposite. And as the airline continued to expand its operations and influence, that contribution promised to reshape not just aviation, but potentially any industry where similar assumptions had gone unchallenged for too long. 1 year to the day after the incident on Flight 792, Naomi and Zoe Jackson found themselves once again at JFK International Airport, preparing to board a flight to Paris. The symmetry was not coincidental. Aurora Airways had deliberately scheduled its inaugural transatlantic flight from New York to Paris to coincide with this anniversary, and Alexander had arranged for his daughters to be passengers on this symbolic journey. The differences between this experience and their previous attempt were immediately apparent. The Aurora Airways terminal space bore little resemblance to the Horizon facility it had replaced. Gone were the velvet ropes and physical barriers that had once separated different classes of passengers. Instead, the check-in area featured a unified design with dedicated lanes for different service levels distinguished by clear signage rather than exclusionary architecture. The staff, diverse in every meaningful demographic dimension, wore uniforms designed for practical elegance rather than to reinforce hierarchical distinctions. Their training under Naomi's neurological adaptation program was evident in interactions that displayed genuine respect regardless of passengers' ticket class or appearance. Most striking was the atmosphere calm, efficient, and notably devoid of the status anxiety that typically permeated premium travel spaces. Passengers moved through the terminal with the relaxed confidence of people who understood exactly what to expect and trusted the system to deliver it without arbitrary exceptions or subjective judgments. As the twins approached the Aurora Lounge, open to premium ticket holders and frequent flyers, but designed without the ostentatious exclusivity that characterized traditional first-class lounges, they were greeted by name by the attendant, a young black woman whose professional warmth carried no hint of the defensive formality often adopted by minority staff in luxury settings. "Dr. Jackson and Dr. Jackson," she said with a genuine smile. "Welcome to Aurora. Your father mentioned you'd be joining us today. We've prepared a quiet space where you can work or relax before boarding." The lounge itself reflected Aurora's distinctive approach to premium service, comfortable and well-appointed without the conspicuous opulence that served primarily to emphasize status differences. The food and beverage offerings were excellent but presented without pretension. The seating areas were designed to facilitate both privacy and interaction according to passenger preference. Several other travelers recognized the twins from media coverage of Aurora's development, approaching with respectful interest to express appreciation for the airline's innovative model. What struck both Naomi and Zoe was the diversity of these premium passengers, not just in racial terms, but across age-apparent socioeconomic indicators and style of dress. Aurora had succeeded in creating a premium travel experience that felt accessible without being diluted. "It's remarkable how different this feels," Zoe observed quietly as they settled into comfortable chairs near the window overlooking the tarmac where Aurora's distinctive aircraft were visible among the international carriers. Not just the physical space, but the emotional atmosphere. The absence of status anxiety is palpable. Naomi agreed, her scientist's mind automatically noting behavioral patterns. Passengers aren't performing their right to be here, and staff aren't enacting gatekeeping rituals. As they continued their observations, Dr. Elena Morales approached their seating area, her presence at the terminal for this symbolic flight, indicative of its importance to Aurora's narrative. "Naomi, Zoe," she greeted them warmly. "I hope you're finding everything satisfactory. This flight represents a significant milestone for us. The implementation of the neurological adaptation program is particularly evident in staff interactions," Naomi noted appreciatively. "The behavioral markers suggest genuine integration rather than performative compliance, and the operational systems appear to be functioning exactly as designed," Zoe added. "The flow patterns through the terminal space show optimal efficiency without creating stress points." Elena smiled at their characteristically analytical assessments. "Your contributions to Aurora's development have been invaluable. What began as a response to discrimination has evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of what air travel can be." Their conversation continued touching on Aurora's expanding influence within the industry and the ways competitors were attempting with varying degrees of success to adopt elements of its approach. Many had implemented superficial changes to service protocols and staff training, but few had undertaken the fundamental cultural and structural transformations that made Aurora's model truly effective. When boarding time approached, the twins proceeded to the gate area where the traditional segregated boarding process had been replaced by Aurora's innovative sequence designed with input from operations research specialists to maximize both efficiency and dignity. First-class passengers still boarded first, but the process was handled without the status announcements and physical separations that traditionally transformed a simple queuing efficiency into a public hierarchy display. Boarding passes were scanned identities confirmed, and passengers welcomed aboard with consistent courtesy, regardless of ticket class or appearance. The crew greeting passengers at the aircraft door maintained the same level of respectful attention for each traveler. Another subtle but significant departure from industry norms, where tone and engagement often varied visibly with passenger status. The aircraft interior reflected the same principles that guided all aspects of Aurora's operations, thoughtfully designed to provide appropriate service differentiation without status hierarchy. First and business class offered the expected space and comfort advantages, but without design elements that unnecessarily emphasized separation from economy. The color palette and materials created visual continuity throughout the aircraft, while accommodating practical differences between service classes. As Naomi and Zoe settled into their first-class suites, the same 1A and 1C positions they had occupied on Flight 792 a year earlier, the contrast with their previous experience could not have been more pronounced. Where Vanessa Miller had projected suspicion and disdain, the Aurora flight attendant Michael displayed genuine welcome. Where Andrew Thompson had claimed entitlement to space, their fellow premium passengers showed simple appreciation for the comfort they had purchased. "Welcome aboard Aurora's inaugural transatlantic service," Michael said as he offered pre-flight beverages. "We're honored to have you with us, especially given the significance of today's date." His acknowledgement of the anniversary was tasteful rather than obsequious, another reflection of the training that emphasized authentic respect rather than performative deference. "Thank you, Michael," Naomi replied with a small smile. "It's certainly a meaningful contrast to our last attempt at this journey." "Aurora exists because of that contrast," he noted thoughtfully. "Many of us came from traditional carriers where we were trained to enforce unwritten rules about who belonged in premium cabins. The liberation of serving without that burden is difficult to overstate." This candid observation highlighted another of Aurora's innovations, creating space for staff to engage authentically rather than through rigidly scripted interactions. The airline's approach recognized that genuine respect couldn't be reduced to standardized phrases or procedural compliance, but required empowering employees to connect as humans within appropriate professional boundaries. As the aircraft prepared for departure, Captain Sarah Chen's voice came over the intercom, another deliberate choice for this symbolic flight. Captain Chen had been first officer on Flight 792, but had objected to Captain Palmer's handling of the situation, though her concerns had been dismissed at the time. Her selection to command Aurora's inaugural transatlantic service represented the airline's commitment to recognizing and elevating staff who demonstrated alignment with its core values. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Aurora Airways Flight 1000 to Paris." She began, her voice warm but authoritative. "Today marks not just our first transatlantic service, but the one-year anniversary of events that catalyzed Aurora's creation. We're especially honored to have Dr. Naomi and Dr. Zoe Jackson with us today, whose experience and expertise have helped shape the airline you're experiencing." This acknowledgement, straightforward rather than excessive, was followed by the standard safety information delivered with the clarity and respect that characterized all of Aurora's passenger communications. As the aircraft lifted into the clear blue sky above New York, Naomi and Zoe shared a glance that contained volumes of shared understanding. What had begun as discrimination had evolved into transformation. What had been intended to exclude had instead created something more inclusive. What had been an assertion of status hierarchy had instead produced a model that challenged such hierarchies while still delivering exceptional service. The journey to Paris proceeded with the operational excellence that had already become Aurora's hallmark. Meals were served with attention to detail that reflected genuine care rather than performed exclusivity. Service interactions were characterized by authentic engagement rather than ritualized deference. The overall experience was one of thoughtful consideration for passenger needs across all service classes. Most striking to the twins, as scientists accustomed to observation, was the different emotional atmosphere compared to traditional premium cabins. The subtle tension that typically permeated such spaces, the constant small assertions of status, the defensive postures of those who felt their belonging might be questioned was notably absent. In its place was a calm assurance that everyone present would be treated with basic dignity regardless of appearance attire or familiarity with premium travel norms. This transformation of the emotional landscape of air travel represented perhaps Aurora's most significant achievement, one that competitors could mimic in superficial ways, but struggled to fully replicate because it required not just procedural changes, but fundamental shifts in organizational culture and operating assumptions. As the flight progressed, Naomi and Zoe each reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, not just the physical journey from New York to Paris, but the larger path from discrimination on Flight 792 to the creation of an airline that was redefining expectations across the industry. Their scientific training had taught them to remain skeptical of easy narratives and premature conclusions. They understood that Aurora's long-term success would depend on maintaining its core principles through inevitable challenges, economic downturns, competitive pressures, regulatory changes, and the natural tendency of organizations to revert to industry norms over time. Yet, the evidence before them suggested something more durable than a temporary disruption or a marketing-driven rebranding. Aurora had built its operational model on principles that produced measurably better outcomes across virtually all relevant metrics, from customer satisfaction to staff retention, from operational efficiency to financial performance. The airline had demonstrated that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, but made sound business sense, challenging the assumption that successful air travel businesses required different treatment based on ticket price to extend beyond service level to basic respect. This insight that excellence and equity were complementary rather than competing values had implications far beyond aviation. It suggested a path forward for any industry where similar assumptions had gone unchallenged for too long, from hospitality to healthcare, from financial services to retail. As Aurora Flight 1000 approached Paris, Charles de Gaulle Airport, after an uneventful crossing of the Atlantic, Captain Chen's voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Paris. On behalf of the entire Aurora team, I want to thank you for joining us on this historic inaugural flight. What you've experienced today represents our vision for the future of air travel, one where exceptional service is delivered with unwavering respect for the dignity of all passengers and staff." The aircraft touched down smoothly on French soil, completing the journey that had been interrupted a year earlier under such different circumstances. As the twins prepared to disembark, Michael approached with a discreet envelope. "A note from your father," he explained. "He asked that it be delivered upon arrival." Inside was a simple handwritten message. "What began with exclusion has ended with transformation. Proud of you both. See you at the villa this evening. Dad." As they walked through the terminal at Charles de Gaulle, Naomi and Zoe noticed the attention Aurora's arrival had garnered aviation industry representatives observing the disembarkation process. Media capturing images of the distinctive aircraft and ordinary travelers watching with curiosity as passengers emerged from what had already become one of the most discussed innovations in recent aviation history. "It appears our little experiment has attracted some attention," Zoe observed with characteristic understatement. "Sufficient to suggest the hypothesis merits further investigation," Naomi replied with the ghost of a smile. Together they continued toward the exit, leaving behind the aircraft that had brought them safely across the ocean, but carrying with them the knowledge that what they had helped create extended far beyond physical transportation. Aurora Airways had become a demonstration of possibility proof that institutions could be built on foundations of dignity without sacrificing excellence, and that in doing so they might discover previously unrecognized potential for both. The journey that had begun with discrimination had culminated not in retribution, but in transformation, not in tearing down, but in building something better. And in that transformation lay a model with implications that extended far beyond one airline, one industry, or even one moment in time. 2 years after the events of Flight 792, a gathering of unusual significance took place at the Aurora Airways Leadership Center, a purpose-built facility designed to embody the principles that had guided the airline's development. Industry executives, Regulatory officials, academic researchers, and corporate leaders from sectors far beyond aviation had assembled to mark the official conclusion of Aurora's transformation phase and the beginning of what its leadership team called sustained evolution. The auditorium hummed with anticipation as Alexander Jackson took the stage, his commanding presence drawing the room to attention without need for formal announcement. At 67, he carried the dignity of a man whose vision had been vindicated not just by commercial success, but by fundamental change in an industry that had resisted such change for decades. 2 years ago, he began his deep voice, carrying effortlessly through the space my daughters experienced discrimination aboard a flight that never reached its destination. Today we gather to mark not just Aurora Airways' remarkable success in the marketplace, but its more profound impact on how we think about the relationship between dignity and excellence in institutional settings. Behind him, screens displayed key metrics from Aurora's first 2 years of operation customer satisfaction scores that led the industry by unprecedented margins, employee retention rates that defied sector norms, operational reliability that set new standards, and financial performance that had silenced early skeptics who insisted that principles and profit were inherently at odds. What began as a response to injustice has evolved into an affirmative demonstration of possibility. Alexander continued, Aurora has proven that treating people with dignity, both passengers and employees, creates a foundation for exceptional performance rather than hindering it. That excellence and equity are not competing values requiring careful balance but complementary principles that, when properly integrated, produce something stronger and more sustainable than either can achieve alone. He gestured toward the audience where Naomi and Zoe sat in the front row. The scientific insights my daughters brought to Aurora's development were essential to its success. Their understanding of cognitive bias patterns and complex adaptive systems helped us move beyond superficial solutions to address root causes of discriminatory behavior. The twins acknowledged the reference with characteristic reserve, their professional accomplishments having long since eclipsed their role as catalysts for Aurora's creation. Naomi had recently been appointed to lead a major research initiative examining institutional bias in healthcare delivery systems, while Zoe had received the prestigious Dirac Medal for her groundbreaking work in applying quantum field theory principles to social system dynamics. But today is about more than acknowledging past achievements. Alexander continued his tone, shifting toward the future focus that had defined his career. It's about recognizing Aurora's potential as a model for institutional transformation far beyond aviation. He introduced a series of speakers who detailed specific aspects of that potential, from the neurological adaptation program that had revolutionized staff training to the operational systems that inherently promoted equity rather than merely policing for discrimination, to the architectural principles that eliminated status hierarchies while maintaining appropriate service differentiation. Dr. Elena Morales, now recognized as one of the most innovative executives in global aviation, presented data showing how Aurora's approach had begun to influence practices across the industry. Competitors who had initially dismissed the airline's model as idealistic experimentation had gradually adopted elements of its approach, some superficially, others with more substantive commitment. The question is no longer whether Aurora's model works, she noted, but how extensively its principles can be applied across different operational contexts and organizational cultures. Throughout the presentations, the underlying theme remained consistent. Aurora had demonstrated that institutions built on dignity, rather than merely policed for discrimination, functioned more effectively across virtually all metrics. That addressing bias at its cognitive and structural roots produced more sustainable change than superficial compliance efforts. That excellence and equity were complementary rather than competing values. As the formal program concluded and attendees moved to networking sessions structured around specific aspects of Aurora's approach, Naomi and Zoe found themselves in conversation with a group of executives from industries ranging from hospitality to healthcare, all eager to understand how Aurora's principles might apply to their particular contexts. The key insight Naomi explained to a hospital system CEO interested in applying the neurological adaptation program to medical staff is that bias operates primarily at the unconscious level through established neural pathways. Traditional sensitivity training targets conscious attitudes while leaving these foundational patterns intact. Our approach, Zoe added, combines behavioral reinforcement with structural systems that prevent bias expression, creating conditions where new neural pathways can form and stabilize over time. Their scientific expertise, translated into practical applications that produced measurable results, had become Aurora's most exportable innovation, one with potential applications far beyond the specific context of air travel. As the day progressed, Alexander joined his daughters for a private moment away from the main gathering. The three found themselves in a quiet garden area designed as a contemplative space for staff. Another example of Aurora's attention to the human dimensions of institutional design. "Your mother would be proud," Alexander said simply, rare emotion evident in his voice. "Not just of what you've accomplished professionally, but of how you've conducted yourselves through all of this. You transformed discrimination into something constructive rather than destructive." "We had an excellent teacher," Zoe replied with a small smile. "Several, actually," Naomi added. "You taught us to stand firm in our dignity. Mom taught us to look for systemic patterns rather than isolated incidents. Together, you showed us that meaningful change requires both principled stands and practical alternatives." Alexander nodded, momentarily overcome by the reference to his late wife, whose influence remained evident in both his daughters' approaches to the world despite her early death. She had been the systems thinker in their partnership, the one who had taught him to look beyond individual actions to the structures that shaped them. "What pleases me most," he said after gathering himself, "is that Aurora has become something that extends beyond any of us. It's not just an airline anymore. It's a demonstration of possibility that will influence institutions long after we're gone. This legacy dimension, the potential for Aurora's principles to reshape expectations across multiple industries and institutional contexts, represented the culmination of what had begun with discrimination on Flight 792. What had started as exclusion had evolved into a model of inclusion that maintained excellence. What had been intended to reinforce hierarchy had instead produced an approach that challenged arbitrary distinctions while still delivering exceptional service. Later that evening, as the formal events concluded and most attendees departed, the Jacksons gathered in Alexander's office for a more personal reflection on Aurora's journey and future direction. The space, like everything at the Leadership Center, embodied the airline's principles designed for functionality and comfort without ostentation, accessible without sacrificing appropriate privacy. "The industry impact has exceeded even my expectations," Alexander admitted, relaxing slightly now that official obligations had concluded. "I anticipated resistance followed by grudging adaptation. I didn't expect this level of proactive engagement across so many sectors." "People recognize effectiveness when they see it," Zoe observed. "Aurora's operational metrics speak for themselves, independent of any moral arguments about dignity and inclusion, which is precisely why the model has translational potential beyond aviation," Naomi added. "It demonstrates that addressing bias produces measurable performance improvements rather than merely satisfying ethical requirements." Their conversation continued, touching on Aurora's expansion plans, the ongoing refinement of its operational systems, and the broader applications of its approach in contexts ranging from educational institutions to corporate environments. Throughout, the underlying theme remained consistent. What had begun as a response to injustice had evolved into an affirmative vision of how institutions could function when built on fundamentally different principles. As the evening concluded and they prepared to go their separate ways, Naomi to a research conference in Tokyo, Zoe to her laboratory at MIT, Alexander to meetings with potential partners for Aurora's next expansion phase. There was a shared sense of having contributed to something that would endure beyond their individual efforts. Aurora Airways had become more than a successful airline, though its commercial performance had certainly silenced early skeptics. It had become a demonstration that excellence and equity weren't competing values requiring careful balance, but complementary principles that, when properly integrated, created something stronger and more sustainable than either could achieve alone. This fundamental insight that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right but made sound business sense had implications far beyond aviation. It suggested a path forward for any industry where similar assumptions had gone unchallenged for too long, from hospitality to healthcare, from financial services to retail. The journey that had begun with two black women being denied their rightful seats on Flight 792 had culminated not in retribution but in transformation, not in tearing down but in building something better. And in that transformation lay a model with implications that extended far beyond one airline, one industry, or one moment in time. As they said their goodbyes, Alexander embraced each daughter in turn, his pride evident, not just in Aurora's success, but in the women they had become, scientists and thought leaders who had applied their considerable intellects to real-world problems with measurable impact. Whatever comes next for Aurora, he said, what you've helped create has already changed expectations about what's possible. That's a legacy that will outlast all of us. In that simple statement lay the true resolution of what had begun 2 years earlier. Not merely success in the marketplace, not just influence within an industry, but a fundamental shift in understanding about the relationship between dignity and excellence in institutional settings. A demonstration that another way was possible not just in aviation, but in any context where human beings came together in organized endeavor. The legacy of Flight 792 wasn't ultimately about one incident of discrimination or even one airline's response to it. It was about proving that institutions could be built on foundations of dignity without sacrificing excellence, and that in doing so they might discover previously unrecognized potential for both. On a bright spring morning 3 years after the events of Flight 792, Vanessa Miller stood in the departure terminal at Denver International Airport, her hands clutching a worn leather purse as she watched passengers stream toward their gates. 3 years had transformed her not just externally with deeper lines around her eyes and silver now prominent in her once blonde hair, but more fundamentally in how she perceived the world around her. After her dismissal from Horizon Airways, Vanessa had initially embraced bitterness, seeing herself as a victim of political correctness, rather than acknowledging her role in perpetuating discrimination. The loss of her career, her pension, and her professional identity had felt catastrophic, a punishment disproportionate to what she still characterized as just doing my job. That perspective had begun to shift only after months of unemployment had forced her to accept a position far below her previous status, working the check-in counter at a budget hotel where she experienced for the first time what it meant to be on the receiving end of the kind of dismissive treatment she had so often dispensed. The wealthy guests barely concealed disdain. The assumptions about her intelligence and worth, based solely on her role, these daily indignities had gradually cracked the defensive shell she'd built around her actions on Flight 792. Now, as she prepared to board an Aurora Airways flight, her first time flying since the incident that had ended her aviation career, Vanessa felt a complex mixture of emotions. Curiosity about the airline that had risen from Horizon's ashes. Anxiety about being recognized, though that seemed unlikely after 3 years and given her changed appearance. And a tentative openness to experiencing as a passenger the service model she had once dismissed as idealistic and impractical. Her ticket was for economy class, all she could afford on her current salary, but the distinction that had once seemed so critical now felt strangely insignificant. As she moved through Aurora's check-in process, she was struck by the absence of the status anxiety that had permeated her former workplace. Passengers of all backgrounds moved through the terminal, with the relaxed confidence of people who trusted they would be treated with basic dignity regardless of appearance or ticket class. The staff, diverse in every meaningful demographic dimension, engaged with each traveler with consistent respect, efficient but never dismissive, helpful but never condescending. Watching their interactions, Vanessa recognized patterns she had once been blind to. The subtle ways traditional airline service had reinforced hierarchy through tone, attention, and body language. As she finally boarded the aircraft, a new generation model featuring Aurora's distinctive cabin architecture, Vanessa was greeted by a flight attendant whose genuine welcome carried none of the status assessment she herself had once automatically performed. "Good morning," the young man said with a smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome aboard Aurora Flight 372 to Chicago. Can I help you find your seat, 27C? Vanessa replied, her voice carrying a hint of the nervousness she felt being back in an aircraft cabin after so long. "Right this way," he responded, gesturing down the aisle with the same courteous attention he had shown the business class passengers who had boarded before her. As Vanessa settled into her economy seat, comfortable within the constraints of the class, designed with attention to ergonomics rather than just space efficiency, she found herself reflecting on how differently she might have handled that day on Flight 792 if she had understood then what seemed so obvious now that dignity wasn't a limited resource to be allocated based on ticket price. That respect cost nothing but created immeasurable value. The irony wasn't lost on her that Aurora Airways, born from the incident that had ended her career, had created a model that made flying better not just for passengers like the Jackson twins, but for everyone, including economy travelers like herself. The airline had demonstrated that excellence and equity weren't competing values, but complementary principles that, when properly integrated, created something stronger and more sustainable than either could achieve alone. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Vanessa noticed a young black girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, being escorted by a flight attendant from economy toward the front of the plane. For a moment, old patterns of thought surfaced, assumptions about who belonged, where judgments about propriety and protocol. Then she saw the flight attendant kneel to the child's eye level, explaining something with genuine engagement rather than condescension. The girl nodded excitedly before disappearing into the first-class cabin, presumably to visit the cockpit or participate in some educational program Aurora was known for implementing. What struck Vanessa wasn't just that such a move would have been unthinkable in her former airline's rigid hierarchy. It was the complete absence of the status performance that would have accompanied it. No announcements reinforcing the child's exceptional treatment. No boundaries emphasized through the temporary crossing of them, just a natural interaction based on educational value rather than exclusivity maintenance. In that small moment, Vanessa glimpsed the full measure of what Aurora had accomplished, not just a more equitable approach to air travel, but a fundamental reimagining of what institutional spaces could feel like when designed to enhance dignity rather than allocate it selectively. As the aircraft lifted into the clear blue sky above Denver, Vanessa Miller felt something unexpected. Not resentment for what she had lost, but a quiet recognition of the validity in Aurora's approach. The airline had proven in practice what had once seemed merely theoretical, that treating people with dignity wasn't just morally right, but made sound operational sense. That recognition didn't erase the consequences of her actions or instantly transform her perspective. Change rarely worked that way, as Aurora's own methodologies acknowledged. But it marked a significant shift in how she understood both her past behavior and the possibility of different institutional models going forward. Meanwhile, across the country at Harvard's Center for Cognitive Neuroscience, Dr. Naomi Jackson was presenting the latest findings from her research on institutional bias patterns to a packed auditorium. The data from Aurora Airways featured prominently in her analysis, providing real-world validation of theoretical approaches to bias mitigation at organizational scales. What Aurora has demonstrated, she explained to the assembled researchers and corporate representatives, is that addressing bias at its cognitive and structural roots produces more sustainable change than superficial compliance efforts. The neurological adaptation program we implemented shows statistically significant modifications to implicit bias measures that have remained stable over the 3-year study period. Simultaneously, at MIT's Quantum Systems Laboratory, Dr. Zoe Jackson was discussing with her research team the broader applications of the complex adaptive systems approach they had pioneered at Aurora. The principles they had applied to airline operations had shown translational potential across multiple institutional contexts, from healthcare delivery systems to educational environments. The key insight Zoe emphasized to her colleagues is that bias-resistant systems can be designed proactively rather than merely remediated reactively. Aurora provided the experimental validation, but the underlying mathematical models have much broader applicability. And at Aurora Airways' global headquarters, Alexander Jackson was meeting with representatives from an international hospitality group interested in applying Aurora's principles to their own operations. At 68, he remained actively engaged in expanding the impact of what had begun as a response to his daughter's treatment, but had evolved into a comprehensive reimagining of institutional design across multiple sectors. "What we've created isn't just an airline," he explained to the hospitality executives. "It's a demonstration that another way is possible, that institutions can be built on foundations of dignity without sacrificing excellence, and that in doing so they might discover previously unrecognized potential for both." These parallel scenes Vanessa experiencing as a passenger, the service model whose validity she had once dismissed Naomi and Zoe, extending the scientific principles that had shaped Aurora's development, and Alexander guiding the broader application of its approach beyond aviation, represented the multifaceted legacy of what had begun 3 years earlier on Flight 792. What had started with discrimination had culminated in transformation. What had been intended to exclude had instead created something more inclusive. What had been an assertion of status hierarchy had instead produced a model that challenged such hierarchies while still delivering exceptional service. The journey that had begun with 2 black women being denied their rightful seats had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that dignity and excellence weren't competing values requiring careful balance, but complementary principles that, when properly integrated, created institutions stronger and more sustainable than traditional models had ever achieved. In that demonstration lay hope not just for more equitable air travel, but for more humane institutional spaces across all sectors where human beings came together in organized endeavor. The legacy of Flight 792 and the response it catalyzed would continue to shape expectations and possibilities long after the specific incidents that had triggered it faded from memory. And in that ongoing influence lay perhaps the most meaningful resolution of all, not retribution for past wrongs, but transformation that prevented future ones. Not just a better airline, but a better model for what institutions could be when built on fundamentally different assumptions about the relationship between dignity and excellence. If this story of transformation and justice resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity and excellence aren't competing values, they're complementary strengths. Have you ever witnessed discrimination or stood up against it? Drop your story in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the most powerful response to injustice isn't tearing things down, but building something better. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in tomorrow's powerful true story.